1983. Hilarious history to fall asleep. Machine of the Year by Mark Twain. Copyright 2026. James Henderson. Chapter 1. The Beige Usurper, in which a plastic box steals my spotlight and the world loses its mind. It has been said, mostly by people who have never had to pilot a steamboat through a fog thick enough to chew, that progress is a steady, noble march toward the light. I have lived long enough to know that progress is more often a series of clumsy stumbles in the dark, usually ending with a man losing his hat and his dignity in a muddy ditch. But even I, a man who has witnessed the birth of the light bulb and the death of common sense in the halls of Congress, was not prepared for the indignity visited upon the human race in the early days of 1983. I am speaking, of course, of Time magazine. For decades, this publication has seen fit to crown a Man of the Year, a title bestowed upon the most influential, the most powerful, or occasionally the most villainous creature to walk upright on two legs. It is a tradition that honors the human spirit, or at least the human ego. But in January of '83, the editors looked out upon a world of 5 billion souls, poets, presidents, scoundrels, and saints, and decided that none of them were quite up to the mark. Instead, they gave the title to a beige plastic box. The Machine of the Year, they called it. I sat in a dimly lit corner of a modern coffee shop, a place where the coffee is served in paper cups and tastes vaguely of disappointment, and stared at that magazine cover. There it sat, the personal computer. It had no face, no limbs, and most distressingly, no mustache. It sat upon a desk like a silent, judgmental loaf of bread, and the world was told to bow down before its computational majesty. The Anatomy of a Plastic Idol. I have spent a lifetime studying the human countenance. I can tell a liar by the twitch of his eyelid and a gentleman by the tilt of his cigar. But how is one to read a creature made of microchips and motherboards? I went to a local department store to inspect one of these mechanical usurpers. It was an IBM, or perhaps a Commodore. The names are as interchangeable as the promises of a political platform. The thing is a marvel of ugliness. It is the color of a rainy Tuesday in London. It possesses a monitor, which glows with a sickly green light reminiscent of a swamp fire or a bad case of dyspepsia. And then there is the keyboard, a clattering array of buttons that promises to turn every man into a typesetter without the benefit of an apprenticeship. I watched a young man in a polyester shirt interact with the machine. He was inputting data. In my day, if you wanted to spend your afternoon staring at a box and tapping your fingers, we called it melancholy and prescribed a trip to the mineral springs. Here, it was called the information revolution. The lad informed me that the machine possessed memory. Memory? I asked. Does it remember the smell of the river after a June rain? Does it remember the sting of a first love or the precise moment a poker hand goes south? He looked at me as if I were speaking Greek. It remembers 64 kilobytes of data, sir, he replied. 64 kilobytes. I do not know what a byte is, but it sounds like a very small portion of a very unappetizing meal. I suspect that a machine's memory is much like a historian's. It remembers the dates and the figures, but forgets all the interesting lies that make the story worth telling. The lie of the floppy disk. Perhaps the greatest deception of '83 is the floppy disk. I was handed one of these objects by a clerk who seemed to think he was handing me the keys to the kingdom. "It's a floppy," he said, with the solemnity of a bishop. I took the object in my hand. It was a square of black plastic, as rigid and unyielding as the moral code of a New England deacon. "My dear boy," I said, "I have seen many things in this world that are floppy. A wet noodle is floppy. A hound dog's ears are floppy. Even the resolve of a temperance advocate at a wedding is notably floppy. But this is a square, a stiff, unbending square." He explained that the inside was floppy. This is the modern way, I suppose, to name things for their hidden qualities rather than their outward appearances. By that logic, we should call a politician an honest man, because somewhere deep inside him, buried under layers of graft and ambition, there might be a sliver of integrity the size of a mustard seed. I am told these discs are used to save work. I find this a terrifying concept. In my era, if you wrote a bad paragraph, you had the decency to burn it in the stove. The smoke went up the chimney, and the world was none the wiser. But now, with the help of the silicon steamboat, your failures are preserved forever in a magnetic tomb. There is no forgetting in 1983. There is only storage. The speed of light and the pace of man. The editors of Time argue that the computer must be honored because it changes the way we live. They speak of speed. They say that the machine can calculate the trajectory of a moon rocket, or the interest on a loan in the blink of an eye. I do not deny that the machine is fast, but I have never found that speed is a guarantee of quality. A steamboat can travel 20 miles an hour down the Mississippi, but that does not mean the passengers are 20 times wiser when they get off. We are living in an age where the word processor allows a man to write 10,000 words in a morning. The tragedy is that he has not been given 10,000 words worth of thoughts to go with them. The computer, you see, lacks the one thing that makes a writer's life worth living: the struggle. When I sit with my pen and my inkwell, there is a holy friction between the thought and the page. There is the smudge of ink on the finger, the scratching of the nib, the deliberate pauses where one considers whether splendid is a better word than sublime. The machine removes the friction. It makes writing as easy as breathing and just as common. If everyone is a writer, then no one is a reader, and we shall all drown in a sea of perfectly spelled nonsense. Kinship with the machine. Despite my grievances, I must admit a certain sneaking kinship with these beige boxes. We both operate on a series of complex internal circuits that no one quite understands. We are both prone to crashing when overloaded with too much input, and we are both, it seems, being relegated to the status of curiosities by a generation that prefers the new to the true. But there is a fundamental difference. The computer is a creature of logic. It knows that 1 and 1 make 2. It cannot comprehend a world where 1 and 1 might make 3, provided the lighting is right and the whiskey is cheap. It cannot tell a joke, for a joke requires a soul. It requires the ability to see the world as it is, and then gently, lovingly lie about it. As I look toward the rest of this year, 1983, I see a horizon crowded with these machines. They are in the offices. They are in the schools. And I am told they are even beginning to find their way into the homes of the unsuspecting. The machine of the year is here to stay. It will balance the checkbooks, it will catalog the grocery lists, and it will eventually, I fear, try to write the novels. But it will never know the joy of a well-placed dam. It will never feel the sun on its back or the salt spray of the sea. I shall continue to navigate these digital rapids, my friends. I have my ink, I have my wit, and I have a healthy distrust of anything that requires a wall socket to function. Let the beige boxes have their magazine covers. I have the river. And the river, unlike a computer, never requires an update to tell you which way the wind is blowing. Chapter 2. The Glass Cockpit, in which I witness a steamboat, flight to the stars, and find the vacuum of space a bit too tidy. I have always maintained that the most sensible way to travel is via a Mississippi steamboat, where the water is thick enough to walk on and the scenery has the decency to stay exactly where the Almighty put it. If a boiler decides to depart this mortal coil in a fit of pique, you are generally deposited into a soft bed of mud and willow trees, which is a fine traditional way for a gentleman to conclude an afternoon's journey. However, in April of 1983, the human race decided that the Earth was getting a bit cramped and that the only logical solution was to strap ourselves to a giant, exploding firework and aim for the moon's backyard. I found myself on the humid, mosquito-infested shores of Florida, a state that is essentially a swamp with a marketing department, to witness the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger. They call it the Space Transportation System, or STS-6, because the government has a pathological fear of using a word that might accidentally evoke a sense of wonder. They prefer acronyms that sound like a middle manager's filing system. But as I stood there, squinting through the heat haze at that towering white obelisk, I saw it for what it truly was, a steamboat with wings designed to navigate a river of starlight. The architecture of insanity. The Challenger is a magnificent piece of engineering, provided your definition of magnificent includes the willingness to sit atop several million pounds of high explosives and hope the technicians weren't feeling particularly underpaid that morning. I was informed by a gentleman in a short-sleeved shirt, a man who possessed enough pens in his pocket to stabilize a small bridge, that the shuttle is the most complex machine ever built. It has 3 main engines, 2 solid rocket boosters, and an external tank that looks like a giant rust-colored cigar. I remarked that it seemed a prodigious amount of fire just to get 5 people out of Florida, but he assured me that gravity is a very stubborn landlord and requires a great deal of persuasion to let you leave the premises. But what fascinated me most was not the fire. I've seen fire. It was the glass cockpit. You see, in the old days, a pilot's cabin was a place of brass, wood, and honest twitching needles. You could look at a dial and see the physical tension of the steam. You could feel the machine, but inside the Challenger, they have replaced the soul of the machine with those same glowing green screens I encountered in the previous chapter. They call it digital instrumentation. The pilots do not look at the sky. They look at television sets that tell them about the sky. It is a curious thing, this modern desire to put a layer of glass between a man and his destiny. I suppose it is safer, but it lacks the romance of the river. A riverboat pilot reads the water by the ripple of the current and the color of the silt. A shuttle pilot reads the universe through a series of bits and pixels. One is a conversation with nature, the other is a formal deposition, the great vertical departure. Then came the countdown. There is something profoundly unnatural about a clock that counts backward. It implies that we are trying to undo time itself, or perhaps that the universe is waiting for us to change our minds. 10, 9, 8. The crowd fell silent. Even the Florida mosquitoes seemed to pause in their relentless pursuit of my jugular. 3, 2, 1. Ignition. At that moment, the earth ceased to be a solid object and became a living, trembling thing. A cloud of steam and fire erupted from the base of the pad, a cloud so vast and white that for a moment I thought a giant had dropped his shaving cream. And then the sound arrived. It was not a bang or a boom. It was a physical assault. It was a roar that seemed to reach into your chest and shake your very ribs, as if to ask why you were still standing on the ground like a sensible person. The Challenger rose. It did not zip. It did not dart. It climbed with a slow, majestic ponderousness, as if it were lifting the weight of the entire world on its shoulders. It punched a hole in the sky, trailing a plume of smoke that looked like a celestial highway. I watched it until it was nothing more than a bright, receding spark, a lonely firefly heading for the blackness of the great void. The vacuum of Mississippi midnight. I am told that once the shuttle reaches its destination, it enters a vacuum. This is a place where there is no air, no sound, and no weather. To a man who has spent his life dodging thunderstorms and navigating treacherous currents, this sounds like a very tidy, if somewhat boring, neighborhood. One of the NASA fellows told me that the vacuum of space is the only place quieter than a Mississippi midnight. I took issue with this. A Mississippi midnight is never truly quiet. It is filled with the chorus of bullfrogs, the rustle of the canebrakes, the distant whistle of a sister ship, and the secret gossip of the water against the hull. Space, by contrast, is a silence that has no story to tell. It is the silence of a library after the books have been burned. The astronauts, I am told, spend their time floating. They do not walk. They drift. They eat their peas out of a tube and sleep on the ceiling. It is a world without up or down, a concept that would drive a river pilot to drink even faster than usual. On the river, up is where the profit is, and down is where the snags are. In space, you can be both at once, which seems to me a very efficient way to become utterly confused. The price of the ticket. As the smoke cleared and the Florida sun returned to its business of melting the pavement, I reflected on the sheer, stubborn gall of the human race. Here we are, a species that hasn't yet figured out how to stop the common cold or ensure that a letter reaches its destination without being mangled by the post office. And yet, we are flinging ourselves at the stars. The cost of this space transportation system is enough to buy every man, woman, and child in Missouri a brand new suit and a decent ham. And yet, we pay it. Why? Because we are a race of pioneers who have run out of prairie. We have fenced in the West, we have mapped the poles, and we have turned the great river into a series of locks and dams. The only thing left that hasn't been ruined by a committee is the stars. I suspect that the Challenger and her sisters are the new Mayflowers. They are carrying our curiosity into a place where it cannot breathe, but where it can finally see. I just hope that when they get where they're going, they don't find that the machine of the year has already set up an office and is waiting to charge them for the oxygen. A final thought on the glass cockpit. As I prepared to leave the Cape, I saw a young boy holding a plastic model of the shuttle. He looked at the sky with a fire in his eyes that no rocket could match. I realized then that the glass cockpit isn't just about computers and screens. It's about the fact that we have turned the entire universe into a window. We are no longer content to look at the dirt beneath our feet. We are looking through the glass at the infinite. It is a dangerous, expensive, and utterly magnificent folly. And as a man who once made a living pretending that a pile of water was a road, I can only tip my hat to the lunacy of it all. Godspeed, Challenger. May your boilers stay tight, your screens stay green, and may you never find a snag in the Milky Way. Chapter 3. The Fiber Optic Thread, in which we discover that light can be domesticated, and the truth is left panting at the starting line. I have long believed that the greatest enemy of the human race, aside from the common housefly and the tax collector, is the sheer unadulterated distance between a man's mouth and another man's ear. In my younger days on the Mississippi, we relied on the telegraph, a fine, jittery invention that turned the English language into a series of frantic stutters. If you wanted to tell your cousin in St. Louis that the cat had caught a mouse, you had to pay a man to tap out a code on a brass key, hoping the lightning didn't decide to take a detour through a soggy telegraph pole along the way. But here, in 1983, the gentleman at the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, known colloquially as Ma Bell, though she strikes me more as a stern governess than a doting mother, have decided that copper wires and brass keys are far too leisurely for the modern appetite. They have unveiled a new marvel, a commercial fiber optic link between New York City and Washington, D.C. They claim to be sending information through a thread of glass no thicker than a horse's hair, using nothing but pulses of light. It is a terrifying thought. We have spent centuries trying to keep light out of our bedrooms so we could sleep, and now we are stuffing it into pipes and burying it in the mud to facilitate the transmission of grocery prices and political platitudes. The architecture of the glass hair. I was granted an inspection of a sample of this fiber. I expected something substantial, something with the heft of a steamboat's hawser. Instead, they handed me a sliver of glass so delicate that if a man were to sneeze with sufficient vigor, he might accidentally send the entire New York Stock Exchange fluttering into the wastebasket. They explained the principle of total internal reflection. It seems that if you aim a beam of light into a glass tube at just the right angle, the light will bounce along the inside like a panicked moth in a lantern, never escaping until it reaches the other end. I told the engineer that I had seen a similar phenomenon in the hallways of the Gilded Age hotels, where a lobbyist would bounce from one mahogany door to another, looking for a senator's ear, but with significantly less speed and much more perspiration. This glass thread, they say, allows for thousands of conversations to happen simultaneously. In my day, a single wire could barely handle a heated argument about a horse trade without the line going faint. Now, you can have 10,000 people in New York telling 10,000 people in Washington that they are having a wonderful time, wish you were here, and the glass hair doesn't even break a sweat. The unholy alliance of New York, and D.C. There is a certain dark poetry in choosing New York and Washington for the first great link. New York is the city that never sleeps because it is too busy counting its money, and Washington is the city that never sleeps because it is too busy inventing new ways to spend it. To connect them with a glass pipe through which lies and ledgers can travel at the speed of light is like building a water slide between a casino and a courthouse. I can only imagine the velocity of a political scandal in this new era. In the 1800s, if a congressman was found with his hand in the till in Washington, the news had to travel by rail or by post. By the time it reached the frontiers of Missouri, the congressman had usually had time to retire, die, and have a statue erected in his honor. But with fiber optics, the man can be caught in the act at noon, and by 12:01, every citizen with a telephone can be properly outraged. It is a grave threat to the dignity of the scoundrel. Without the lag time of the traditional post, a man has no time to prepare a plausible denial or flee to Mexico. We are moving toward a world where the consequence arrives at the same moment as the crime, which is a very discouraging prospect for the ambitious rogue. The speed of light versus the rumor in Hannibal. The scientists are very proud of the fact that light travels at 186,000 miles per second. They call it the universal speed limit. They seem to think this is a new record. I, however, have spent considerable time in Hannibal, Missouri, and I can tell you that the speed of light is a sluggish crawl compared to the speed of a well-placed rumor regarding the Widow Douglas's new hat. I recall a Tuesday in my youth when a rumor started at the blacksmith shop at 9 in the morning. The rumor suggested, entirely without evidence, mind you, that the local schoolmaster had been seen in the company of a traveling circus performer. At 9:05 a.m., the rumor had crossed the street to the apothecary. At 9:15 a.m., it had climbed the hill to the church. By 10 a.m., the schoolmaster was being burned in effigy by the Temperance Society, despite the fact that he was actually at home in bed with a head cold. That rumor didn't need a glass thread or a laser beam. It traveled via the most efficient conductor known to man, the human tongue, lubricated by a lack of something better to do. If we could harness the kinetic energy of a small-town gossip, we wouldn't need fiber optics. We could power the entire nation on nothing but "Did you hear?" and "Heaven forfend." The tragedy of the fiber optic thread is that it attempts to give the truth a fighting chance. But light, for all its speed, is a literal-minded thing. It carries what you give it. If you give it a lie, it carries a lie. And a lie that travels at 186,000 miles per second is a formidable enemy. It means that the truth doesn't even have time to get its boots on before the lie has already circled the globe and been elected to a second term. The burden of instant knowledge. One must ask, what shall we do with all this speed? The engineers tell me we are entering the information age. They speak as if information and wisdom were the same thing, as if a man who receives 1,000 telegrams a day is 10 times smarter than the man who receives one thoughtful letter a month. I have observed that the more information a man has, the less he seems to know what to do with his own hands. We are becoming a race of frantic recipients, waiting for the next pulse of light to tell us what to think, what to buy, and whom to loathe. When I was on the river, the information I needed was simple. the depth of the water, the position of the snags, and the smell of the coming rain. That information traveled at the speed of the current, which gave a man time to reflect on it. If the water was low, you had an hour to consider your options before you ran aground. In the age of fiber optics, you're told you have run aground the nanosecond it happens, and usually by a machine that is programmed to mock you for it. A glass future. As I look at this New York to Washington link, I see the beginning of a web that will eventually entangle the entire world. We are spinning a cocoon of glass around the planet. We will be able to talk to a man in Tokyo or a lady in London as easily as if they were sitting on our front porch. But will we have anything better to say, or will we simply use the speed of light to broadcast our ignorance to a wider audience? I suspect the latter. We are a species that will spend billions of dollars to build a glass highway across the continent, only to use it to transmit pictures of cats and arguments about the weather. It is a magnificent, glittering toy, and like all toys, it will eventually break or become a nuisance. Still, I cannot help but admire the audacity of it, to take a handful of sand, turn it into glass, and use it to tame the lightning. It is a feat that would make even the most seasoned riverboat pilot pause in admiration. I shall keep my eye on this fiber optic thread. If it can truly deliver the news from Washington without the smell of the swamp clinging to it, it will be the greatest miracle of the 20th century. But for now, I think I shall stick to the old-fashioned way of communicating. I shall write my thoughts on paper, seal them in an envelope, and trust them to the slow, honest hands of the Postal Service. It gives the reader time to prepare for the shock of my brilliance, and it gives me time to change my mind if I realize I've been an idiot. Speed is for the light. Reflection is for the soul. Chapter 4. The Plastic Revolution. In which time loses its dignity, and the Swiss decide to sell us picnic utensils for the wrist. In my day, which was a long, dusty stretch of years that didn't feel the need to move particularly fast, time was a serious business. A man's watch was not merely a tool, it was a character reference. It was a heavy, brass-cased turnip that lived in your waistcoat pocket, attached to a chain thick enough to moor a small skiff. When you pulled it out, it was a ceremony. You snapped open the lid with a sound like a pistol shot, squinted at the Roman numerals through a haze of cigar smoke, and felt the sheer gravitational weight of the seconds ticking by. That watch didn't just tell the time, it enforced it. But as I navigate the neon-soaked rapids of 1983, I find that time has undergone a most distressing transformation. It has been stripped of its brass, its gears, and its gravitas. It has been melted down, dyed the color of a startled flamingo, and rebranded as something called a swatch. The Great Swiss Panic. To understand the swatch, one must understand the plight of the Swiss. For centuries, the Swiss have had two primary exports: holes in cheese and the most complicated machinery ever devised by the human hand. A Swiss watchmaker was a man who spent his life hunched over a workbench, peering through a magnifying glass at a gear the size of a gnat's eyelash, all to ensure that your watch would only lose 3 seconds every decade. However, a few years back, the Japanese arrived with something called quartz. They discovered that if you run a bit of lightning through a sliver of rock, the rock vibrates with a terrifying robotic consistency. It was cheaper, it was faster, and it didn't require a master craftsman with the patience of a saint. The Swiss watch industry, consequently, began to keel over like a horse that had seen a ghost. I am told that by 1983, the Grand Masters of Geneva were in a state of absolute quartz crisis. They were facing the prospect of having to actually eat all that cheese themselves. And so, in a fit of desperate genius, they decided that if they couldn't beat the cheap plastic watches, they would become the most expensive, most colorful, and most absurdly popular plastic watches in history. The birth of the disposable second. I walked into a jewelry shop in New York to see these marvels for myself. I expected velvet cushions and hushed tones. Instead, I found a display that looked like a bowl of jelly beans had exploded in a toy factory. There they were, the swatches. They were made of synthetic polymers, which is a fancy $5 word for the same stuff they use to make cheap picnic forks, and those little green army men the children leave on the stairs for their fathers to trip over. The clerk, a young woman with hair that appeared to have been styled by an electrical socket, informed me that the swatch was a fashion accessory. "My dear," I said, "a fashion accessory is a silk cravat or a well-blocked beaver hat. A watch is a moral compass for the day's activities. One does not accessorize with the relentless march of eternity." She laughed, a sound like a bag of nickels, and told me that people were buying 3 or 4 of them at a time. "It's the second watch, Mr. TwAIn. That's what the name means, S-Watch." A second watch? I was aghast. The very notion implies that your first watch is somehow insufficient, or perhaps that you have a spare set of hours tucked away in your pocket in case the first 24 get soiled. It is the pinnacle of modern decadence. We have made time itself disposable. We have turned the great mystery of the universe into a trinket that you can swap out to match your socks. The neon sense of 83. The colors of these contraptions are an affront to any man who values his eyesight. There are swatches in electric blue, radiant pink, and a shade of green that I have only previously seen on the surface of a stagnant pond in mid-August. Furthermore, I am told that some of these watches are scented. One can purchase a watch that smells like a raspberry or a banana. Think of the implications. In my era, if a man smelled of raspberries, we assumed he had been involved in a tragic accident at a preserves factory. Now, a gentleman can walk down the street and have his wrist emit the fragrance of a tropical fruit salad while he checks to see if he is late for his dentist appointment. It is a confusing time to have a nose. And let us not forget the Swatch Guard. This is a small rubberized cage that snaps over the face of the watch to prevent the plastic from scratching. It looks for all the world like a tiny set of brass knuckles for a midget. I asked the clerk why one would need to protect a watch that costs $35 and is made of the same material as a butter tub. "It's for the look, sir," she replied. The look? Of course. We are living in an age where people will pay extra to make a cheap object look like it's being held together by surgical tubing. The multi-watch menace. But the true madness of 1983 is the practice of wearing more than one watch at a time. I saw a young man on the subway who had 3 swatches strapped to his left arm and 2 on his right. "Son," I asked him, "are you perhaps a navigator for a fleet of ships? Are you keeping track of the time in London, Tokyo, Paris, and Hannibal simultaneously?" He looked at his forest of plastic wrists and shrugged. No, man, it just looks cool. Plus, I can't decide which color I like better today. I walked away, mourning the loss of human reason. There is an old saying, a man with one watch knows what time it is. A man with two watches is never sure. I hate to think what a man with 5 watches knows. He likely knows he has more money than sense, but he probably can't tell you if it's 6:30 or Tuesday. We have taken the one constant in the universe, the steady rhythmic beat of the cosmic heart, and turned it into a stack of colorful bangles. It is as if we decided that since we cannot stop the aging process, we might as well make the gray hairs neon pink and call it a trend. The silence of the quartz. The most haunting thing about the Swatch, however, is its silence. My old brass watch had a heartbeat. If you held it to your ear in the quiet of the night, you could hear it working. Tick-tock, tick-tock. It was the sound of tiny hammers forging the future. It was a companion. It reminded you that you were alive and that your time was a precious, finite resource that was being consumed one click at a time. A Swatch does not tick. It does not breathe. It is powered by a battery, a small silver lozenge that will eventually leak its caustic juices into the plastic guts of the machine and kill it. There is no soul in a quartz movement. It is a cold, calculated vibration. It tells you the time with a terrifying, soulless accuracy, but it doesn't care if you use that time to write a masterpiece or to stare at a wall. A plastic legacy. As I sit here watching the sun set over a world that is increasingly made of synthetic polymers, I cannot help but admire the Swiss. They saw the end of their world coming, and they saved themselves by embracing the very thing that was destroying them. They turned the watch from a legacy into a whim. They proved that if you wrap a bit of garbage in enough bright colors and call it limited edition, the public will beat a path to your door and thank you for the privilege of being cheated. 1983 will be remembered for many things. The digital dawn, the space shuttle, the fiber optic thread. But in the quiet moments, when the neon lights dim, I think it will be remembered as the year we stopped respecting time and started wearing it like a mood ring. I shall keep my old turnip, thank you very much. It may be heavy, it may be slow, and it certainly doesn't smell like a banana. But when I snap that lid shut, I know exactly where I stand in the stream of history. And I don't need a rubber guard to tell me that a man's time is worth more than $35 and a bit of pink plastic. Chapter 5. War Games and Cold Bites, in which a stripling with a telephone nearly sets the world on fire, and I discover that strategy is a fancy word for not being an idiot. I have observed that the human race is never so happy as when it is inventing new ways to frighten itself out of its wits. In my own century, we concerned ourselves with honest, tangible terrors, steamboat explosions, cholera, and the prospect of running out of tobacco. These were terrors you could look in the eye. But in this year of 1983, the public has developed a taste for a more sophisticated brand of panic, a digital dread that lives inside the wires and feeds on the binary dreams of a beige plastic box. To satisfy this peculiar craving, I followed a throng of teenagers into a darkened theater to witness a motion picture titled War Games. I was informed that the film concerned a young man, a telephone, and the end of civilization. I must say, as a man who once nearly burned down a small portion of Nevada with a poorly placed campfire, I felt a certain kinship with any youth capable of such a prodigious feat of mischief. The adolescent as an archangel of doom. The story introduces us to a lad named David Lightman, a youth who possesses that terrifying combination of high intelligence and a total lack of something better to do. David is what the modern world calls a hacker. In my day, if you wanted to get into a place where you weren't invited, you used a crowbar or a very persuasive lie. David, however, uses a computer and an acoustic coupler, a device that looks like a pair of earmuffs for a telephone. I watched with morbid fascination as this boy sat in his bedroom surrounded by empty soda cans and the general debris of adolescence, and proceeded to dial up the most sensitive computers in the United States military. "He is fishing," I whispered to a young man sitting next to me. "No," the lad whispered back, "he's war dialing." Whatever you call it, it is a magnificent indignity to the Pentagon. Here is a building that costs the taxpayers millions of dollars, guarded by men with medals on their chests and grim expressions on their faces, and they are being outmaneuvered by a boy who hasn't even begun to shave. It is as if the Great Wall of China were breached by a toddler with a plastic spoon. The WOPR, a steamboat, captain with no soul. Eventually, our young hero connects his bedroom computer to a machine called the WOPR, War Operation Plan Response. The military men call it Joshua, which is a biblical name for a machine that lacks the moral complexity of a turnip. The WOPR is housed in a mountain, literally. They have hollowed out a piece of the earth to accommodate a computer that spends its days calculating the most efficient way to turn the planet into a cinder. I have seen many stubborn things in my life, mules, congressmen, and riverboat pilots who think they own the Mississippi. But the WOPR is the most stubborn of them all. It is a machine designed to win, and it does not understand that in some contests, winning is just a polite term for being the last person to die. The trouble begins when David, thinking he is merely playing a game from a software company, asks the machine, "Shall we play a game?" The machine suggests global thermonuclear war. Now, if a stranger in a bar asks if you'd like to play a game of global thermonuclear war, any sensible man would finish his drink and find a different bar. But David is a youth of the 80s, and he agrees. Suddenly, the screens in the mountain begin to light up with trajectories. To the computer, there is no difference between a game of tic-tac-toe and the annihilation of the Soviet Union. It is all just bits and bytes, cold, calculating logic that lacks the imagination to realize that if it wins, there will be no one left to buy it a fresh ribbon or oil its gears. The acoustic coupler and the silence of the wires. I must dwell for a moment on the acoustic coupler. It is the most absurd contraption I have yet encountered. To connect to the world, you must take your telephone, an instrument meant for the human voice, and jam it into 2 rubber cups. Imagine if we did this with other forms of communication. If you wanted to send a letter, you would have to scream it into the ear of a horse and hope the horse remembered the message when it reached the next town. It is a clunky, wheezing bridge between the analog world of sound and the digital world of silence. And yet, through this rubberized umbilical cord, the boy is able to talk to the mountain. It struck me then that the Cold War is aptly named. It is a war fought through cold wires, by cold men, staring at cold screens. In my era, if you wanted to start a war, you had to at least get your boots muddy. Now, you can do it in your pajamas while eating a peanut butter sandwich. The tic-tac-toe revelation. The climax of the film involves a frantic attempt to stop the WOPR from launching the real missiles. The humans are shouting, the lights are flashing, and the tension is high enough to snap a steamboat's cable. And how do they stop the machine? Do they hit it with a hammer? Do they pray? No. They teach it to play tic-tac-toe. I laughed so hard I nearly lost my spectacles. The most powerful computer in the world is forced to play a game against itself. Thousands of games of tic-tac-toe in a matter of seconds. It fills its memory with every possible outcome, only to realize that if both players are even moderately competent, the game always ends in a draw. The screens go wild. The trajectories flicker and fade. And then the machine speaks its final, most profound line. A strange game. The only winning move is not to play. It is a stunning moment of mechanical epiphany. A machine made of silicon and logic managed to arrive at a conclusion that has eluded the kings, emperors, and presidents of Earth for 5,000 years. If you must fight a war where the only outcome is the total erasure of both parties, the most strategic thing you can do is stay in bed and read a book. The Cold Bites of Reality. As I exited the theater and stepped back into the world of 1983, I felt a strange sense of unease. The audience around me was laughing and chatter, relieved that the movie was over. But I looked at the payphones on the street corners and the glowing signs of the computer shops, and I realized that we have built a world that is far more fragile than we care to admit. We have handed the keys of the kingdom to Joshua and his brothers. We have decided that the speed of a computer is more valuable than the wisdom of a man. We are living in a time of cold bites, where a single error in a line of code could be the difference between a Tuesday morning and a permanent midnight. I am told that the President of the United States, a gentleman named Reagan, saw this film and was so moved by it that he asked his generals if such a thing could actually happen. The generals, no doubt adjusting their ties and looking at their shoes, had to admit that it wasn't entirely impossible. It is a fine state of affairs when the safety of the world depends on whether or not a computer has learned the lessons of a children's pencil and paper game. I think I shall take the machine's advice. I shall find a quiet corner, a good cigar, and a game of checkers. Checkers is a far superior game. At least when you lose, you only lose your pride and not your entire zip code. A lesson for the ages. The lesson of 1983, it seems, is that we are all hackers now, whether we like it or not. We are all connected to the mountain by an invisible glass thread, and we are all playing games we don't quite understand. My advice to the modern world is simple. If a machine ever asks you if you'd like to play a game, tell it you're busy. Tell it you're going for a walk, or that you're busy practicing your mustache grooming, because, as the WOPR discovered, the only way to truly win at the game of madness is to refuse to pick up the dice in the first place. And for heaven's sake, if you see a teenager with an acoustic coupler and a look of intense concentration, buy him a bicycle and send him outside. The world has enough trajectories as it is. What we need is more people who know how to sit on a porch and do absolutely nothing at all. Chapter 6. The C4 Revelation, in which I encounter a motor car from the future, a dashboard from a gambling den, and a chronological lie of spectacular proportions. If there is one thing I have learned in my travels through the tattered fabric of time, it is that the American businessman possesses a creative relationship with the truth that would make a Mississippi poker player weep with envy. In the spring of 1983, I found myself in Bowling Green, Kentucky, a place famous for its rolling hills, its fine tobacco, and a factory that produces a fiberglass contraption known as the Corvette. I had been told that the future of the American road was being unveiled. Naturally, I expected a vehicle for the current year. But when I arrived at the assembly plant, a building so clean it felt like a hospital for machines, I was introduced to the 1984 Corvette. "Pardon me," I said to a man wearing a clip-on tie and an expression of intense corporate piety, "but my calendar, which I consult with the regularity of a man checking his pulse, informs me quite clearly that it is currently 1983. Has the sun skipped a beat? Have we lost 12 months in a fog of collective amnesia?" The man smiled the oily smile of a salesman. "No, Mr. TwAIn, we simply skipped the 1983 model year entirely. This is the next generation arriving early." By the great horned spoon! To simply delete a year from the records because your new toy isn't quite ready is a feat of audacity I haven't seen since the railroad tycoons tried to convince the public that a 3-hour delay was actually a leisurely scenic pause. It is a chronological lie of spectacular proportions, and I found myself liking the car already, purely on the basis of its dishonesty. The plastic sled of the space age. The vehicle in question, the C4, as the initiates call it, looks less like a carriage and more like a doorstop designed by an inhabitant of Mars. It is low, it is wide, and it is made of fiberglass, which is essentially a salad of glass and glue that has been pressed into the shape of a dream. I circled the machine with the wariness I usually reserve for a stray dog with a suspicious glint in its eye. It has pop-up headlights, which remain hidden during the day like a pair of bashful eyes, only to emerge at night with a mechanical whir. I asked if the car was shy. The salesman informed me it was for aerodynamics. Aerodynamics, I mused. In my day, if you wanted to go faster, you simply added more wood to the fire and prayed the boiler didn't decide to visit the stratosphere. Now, we shape our cars like a wedge of cheese so they can slide through the air without offending it. The Star Wars dashboard, a neon nightmare. But the true revelation, the C4 moment that made me question the sanity of the modern engineer, occurred when I climbed into the cockpit. I say cockpit because driver's seat is far too humble a term for this padded cavern. You do not sit in a Corvette, you are swallowed by it. You are pinned into a bucket seat that hugs your ribs with the fervor of a long-lost ant, leaving you wondering if you're about to drive to the grocery store or be launched into a low Earth orbit. And then the salesman turned the key. In an instant, the world before me erupted in a kaleidoscope of glowing green and orange. This was not a dashboard. It was a neon sign for a cheap saloon in a mining camp. Gone were the honest, twitching needles of my youth, those faithful brass indicators that told you how much steam you had left before the end of the world. In their place were liquid crystal displays, LCDs. "Behold," the salesman whispered, "the digital age." I beheld it, and I was blinded. There was a digital speedometer that flashed numbers at me with the frantic energy of a telegraph operator during a flood. There was a tachometer that looked like a staircase leading to a fever dream. Every vital statistic of the engine was rendered in glowing bars and blocks. "My dear fellow," I said, "I came here to drive, not to balance a ledger. Why must I be informed of my oil pressure in the same visual language used by a Donkey Kong machine? Does the car intend to award me points if I reach 60 miles per hour without hitting a pedestrian?" The loss of the tactile click. There is a fundamental tragedy in the death of the needle. A needle is a physical thing. When it climbs, you can feel the tension. When it drops, you can feel the relief. It is a dialogue between the man and the machine. But a digital number is a cold, abstract thing. It simply is. Furthermore, I noticed that the dashboard offered a button to switch between English and metric measurements. "Why?" I asked. "So you can see your speed in kilometers, sir." "I have never been to a country that uses kilometers," I replied, "and I have no intention of starting now, especially while traveling at 80 miles an hour in a plastic sled. If I am to be arrested for speeding, I prefer to know exactly how many honest American miles I am over the limit." The complexity of it all is staggering. There are buttons for instant fuel economy, average speed, and something called trip odometer. It seems the modern driver is no longer content to simply arrive at his destination. He must be accompanied by a mechanical accountant who calculates the cost of every sneeze and every turn of the wheel. We are turning the joy of the open road into a statistical analysis. The roar of the 205 horses. Beneath the fiberglass hood sits a V8 engine that produces 205 horsepower. I was told this was a return to performance, as if the horses had been on a long vacation since the mid-70s and had finally decided to come home to work. When the engine roared to life, however, the digital nonsense faded for a moment. That sound, that deep, rhythmic thrum, is a language even a 19th century soul can understand. It is the sound of power. It is the sound of 1,000 tiny explosions happening in perfect harmony, all for the purpose of propelling a gentleman toward the horizon at a speed that would make a locomotive look like a tortoise with a limp. I took the wheel. The car moved with a terrifying precision. In a steamboat, you suggest a direction to the vessel, and about 10 minutes later, the boat decides whether or not to comply. The Corvette, however, responds to the slightest twitch of the finger. It is like steering a thought. But every time I glanced down to see how fast I was going, I was met with that glowing green 84. It was a constant reminder that I was driving a car from a year that didn't yet exist, in a world that was rapidly losing its grip on the physical. The Corvette as a symbol of 83. As I stepped out of the car, my legs feeling a bit like jelly and my eyes still seeing spots of neon orange, I realized that the C4 Corvette is the perfect mascot for 1983. It is a machine that is trying desperately to be the future while still being tethered to the past. It has a high-tech heart of fiberglass and silicon, but it still runs on good old-fashioned gasoline and human ego. It is flashy, it is slightly dishonest about its age, and it is obsessed with its own data. We are entering an era where we no longer trust our senses. We need a screen to tell us we are moving. We need a graphic to tell us the engine is warm. We need a beep to tell us we have left our keys in the ignition. We are surrounding ourselves with digital intermediaries, as if we are afraid to touch the world directly. I left Bowling Green that day with a profound respect for the engineers, but a lingering sadness for the needle. The needle was the last vestige of the Gilded Age, a physical link between the force and the effect. Now, we are all just watching the numbers change, hoping that the machine of the year knows what it's doing. I think I shall go back to my hotel and sit in a wooden chair. A chair that doesn't have a lumbar support button or a digital display of its own weight. I shall smoke a cigar and contemplate a world where a car is just a car and 1983 is allowed to be 1983 without being bullied by a 1984 that is in a suspicious hurry to arrive. Chapter 7. The Day After, in which the American public chooses to spend a Sunday evening watching its own extinction, and I discover that doom is the most popular form of variety show. I have long maintained that the human race is a most peculiar collection of contradictions. We are a species that will spend a fortune on a fancy hat to look respectable at a funeral. Yet we are also the only creatures on this green earth who will pay good money to sit in a darkened room and watch a theatrical reenactment of our own demise. In my era, if a man stood on a street corner and shouted that the world was about to end in a blaze of fire and ash, we generally gave him a wide berth and perhaps a small coin for his trouble. In November of 1983, however, the American public did not avoid the prophet of doom. They gave him a primetime television slot and a multi-million-dollar advertising budget. The event was a motion picture titled The Day After. It was broadcast on a Sunday evening, a time traditionally reserved in the American household for the consumption of roast beef, the avoidance of homework, and perhaps a light-hearted program about a talking horse or a misunderstood detective. But on this particular Sabbath, some 100 million souls, nearly half the population of the Republic, gathered round their glowing glass altars to witness the total scorched earth annihilation of Lawrence, Kansas, the architecture of the must-see catastrophe. The build-up to this broadcast was a feat of marketing that would have made P.T. Barnum blush with envy. For weeks, the newspapers and the evening news, those frantic daily bulletins I've discussed previously, were filled with dire warnings. We were told that the film would be so distressing, so psychologically taxing, that counseling hotlines would be established to talk citizens down from the ledge of despair. I found this a magnificent piece of showmanship. It is one thing to sell a show. It is quite another to sell a show by telling the audience that they might require medical intervention just to survive the experience. Do not let your children watch alone, the networks whispered with the solemnity of a judge passing sentence. Have a discussion afterward. Keep the lights on. Pray for the soul of the prairie. Naturally, this had the effect of ensuring that every man, woman, and child in the nation was glued to their seat. If you tell an American that something is too dangerous for his delicate sensibilities, he will break down the door to get a better look at it. We are a people built on a foundation of watch this, and the prospect of seeing the Soviet Union turned the Midwest into a bowling alley was simply too enticing to pass up. Why Lawrence, Kansas? The choice of setting for our apocalypse was Lawrence, Kansas. I asked a gentleman why they had picked such a quiet, unassuming place. "Because it's the heart of the country, Mr. TwAIn," he explained. "It's where the silos are. If the missiles fly, Kansas is the bullseye." I felt a twinge of sympathy for the Kansans. It is a state that has already endured bleeding Kansas, the temperance movement, and a startling lack of shade trees. To now be selected as the primary target for 1,000 megatons of Russian hospitality seemed a bit excessive. I suspect the producers chose it because Kansas is the very definition of wholesome. If you want to shock the public, you don't blow up New York. Everyone expects New York to go eventually, likely due to an excess of its own ego. But to incinerate a university town where the biggest scandal is usually the price of grain, that is a stroke of dramatic genius. The mundanity before the fire. The first half of the film is a masterclass in what the moderns call foreshadowing, which is a fancy literary term for waiting for the other shoe to drop. We are introduced to a variety of pleasant Kansans, a doctor, played by a gentleman named Jason Robards, who possesses a face as craggy and reliable as a riverbed, a young farmer, and a family preparing for a wedding. They go about their business with a terrifying normalcy. They eat breakfast, they argue about the car, they worry about the future. Meanwhile, in the background, the television and the radio are constantly murmuring about tensions in Berlin and troop movements in the Eastern Bloc. It reminded me of a summer afternoon on the Mississippi just before a cyclone hits. The air gets heavy, the birds stop singing, and the water turns a sickly shade of green. You know something is coming, but you keep on painting the fence because you don't know what else to do. The tragedy of the day after isn't the explosion. It's the fact that the people are still worrying about their wedding invitations while the sky is preparing to fall on their heads. The great toadstool of doom. Then the moment arrives. The Cold War suddenly turns very hot indeed. The missiles, those sleek silver Minutemen that live in the cornfields, erupt from the ground like mechanical locusts. I have seen some spectacular fires in my time. I have seen steamboats go up in a pillar of flame that lit the river for 10 miles. But the cinematic nuclear exchange is a different breed of horror. On the screen, we see the flash, a light so bright it turns the human frame into a skeleton for a brief, flickering second. It is as if the sun has decided to come down for a visit and has forgotten its manners. And then come the mushroom clouds. I call them the great toadstools of doom. They rose over the Kansas horizon in a slow, silent bloom of gray and orange. In that moment, the machine of the year, the computer, proved its worth by calculating the exact trajectory required to turn a barbershop into a memory. The special effects were, I am told, quite revolutionary. To me, they looked like a vision from the book of Revelation, if St. John had been given a budget from ABC and a background in pyrotechnics. People were vaporized, buildings were flattened, and the entire landscape of the American dream was reduced to a charcoal sketch. The silence of the commercials. Perhaps the most startling thing about the broadcast was the behavior of the advertisers. In the modern age, a television program is merely a series of excuses to sell you soap, cigarettes, or a new way to clean your floor, but for the second half of the day after, After the bombs had fallen on the screen, there were no commercials. The big companies, Sears, Roebuck, and the rest, evidently decided that it was bad form to try and sell a washing machine to a public that was currently contemplating its own charred remains. Buy our detergent. It's perfect for removing radioactive soot from your Sunday best. Even the capitalists have their limits. The result was a series of long, hollow silences between the scenes of radiation sickness and starvation. It was a silence that spoke louder than any salesman. It was the silence of a nation that had suddenly realized that if the day after actually happened, there wouldn't be anyone left to buy anything, and a world without customers is the only hell a corporate executive truly fears. The post-game apocalypse. When the film ended, on a note of such profound misery that I found myself checking my own pulse just to be sure I hadn't been vaporized by proxy, the network did not return to its regularly scheduled programming. Instead, they held a panel discussion. It was a duel of the high priests of the 20th century. On one side, you had Dr. Carl Sagan, a man who speaks of the stars with a lyrical grace, warning us about nuclear winter. He argued that even if you survive the blast, the smoke will block out the sun and turn the world into a giant icebox. On the other side, you had gentlemen like William F. Buckley and Henry Kissinger, who spoke in the measured, gravelly tones of realpolitik. They argued about deterrence and strategic depth. I watched them with a growing sense of absurdity. Here were some of the finest minds of the age, sitting in a studio arguing about the best way to avoid a disaster that they had just spent 2 hours depicting in vivid color. It was like two men standing in a room waist-deep in gunpowder, debating the relative merits of different brands of matches. The moral of the soot. As I walked out into the cool November air of 1983, I noticed that the world was still there. The streetlights were on, the cars were moving, and the air did not smell of ozone and ash. There was a palpable sense of relief in the streets, as if the entire country had just woken up from a collective nightmare. What did we learn from the day after? I suspect we learned that we are a very clever species that has built a very stupid world. We have harnessed the power of the stars and used it to threaten our neighbors over a disagreement about whose ism is superior. We have turned the machine of the year into a bookkeeper for Armageddon. But I also saw something else. I saw that for one night, the entire nation stopped arguing. The Democrats and the Republicans, the city dwellers and the farmers all sat down and looked into the abyss together. And when they looked into that abyss, they didn't see enemies or commies or capitalists. They saw themselves, frightened, fragile, and far too fond of breakfast to let it all go up in smoke. It is a pity that it takes a 2-hour horror movie to remind us that we are all in the same boat. I only hope that the leaders of the world were watching and that they realized that the day after is a story that is much better told on a television screen than on the front page of the morning paper. For my part, I shall go and find a very large piece of pie. If the world is to end, I should like to be found with a fork in my hand and a bit of cinnamon on my chin. It is the only sensible, strategic response I can think of. Chapter 8. The Fraggle Rock Philosophy, in which I discover a subterranean utopia of singing mops and realize that the great powers could learn a thing or two from a trash heap. After the grueling ordeal of witnessing the televised end of the world, an experience that left me with a lingering desire to move to a cave and survive entirely on canned peaches and Sprite, I found myself in desperate need of a spiritual tonic. I sought a vision of humanity that was not currently engaged in the business of vaporizing itself. I found this vision, quite unexpectedly, behind a hole in the wall of an elderly inventor's workshop. In the early months of 1983, a gentleman by the name of Jim Henson, a man who apparently possesses the divine power to breathe life into felt, foam, and ping-pong balls, introduced the world to Fraggle Rock. I was informed that this was a children's program, but after 20 minutes of observation, I realized that Henson had achieved something the United States Department of State hasn't managed in 2 centuries. He had created a functioning system of international diplomacy that didn't involve anyone threatening to push the button. The architecture of the whole. The premise of this spectacle is a masterpiece of absurdity. There is a workshop inhabited by a man called Doc, who spends his time inventing things that don't work, and a dog named Sprocket, who is clearly the intellectual superior of everyone else in the building. Behind a small opening in the baseboard lies a subterranean world of caves, tunnels, and a species of colorful hyperactive creatures known as Fraggles. Fraggles, as far as I can tell, are the leisure class of the underworld. They have no visible means of support, no industry, and no taxes. They spend their days singing, dancing, and engaging in games that involve falling down a great deal. They are the inhabitants of a gilded age that never ended, possessing the carefree spirit of a riverboat pilot who has just discovered the owner is paying for the coal. I watched them with a mixture of envy and bewilderment. "They have no jobs," I remarked to a young viewer. "They have fraggling, sir," the child replied. "Ah," I said, "in my day we called that loitering, and the sheriff generally had a very specific philosophy regarding its practitioners, usually involving a broom and a firm nudge toward the county line." The doozer work ethic, a capitalist fever dream. But the Fraggles are not alone in their caves. They share their space with the doozers. These are tiny, green-helmeted fellows who are the very personification of the Protestant work ethic. Taken to a pathological extreme, the doozers do nothing but build. They use a substance made of radish dust to construct elaborate crystalline structures that look like a cross between a Gothic cathedral and a very expensive chandelier. They work 24 hours a day, driven by a biological imperative to create infrastructure. And here is the stroke of Henson's genius. The Fraggles eat the doozer constructions. I sat back, stunned by the elegance of it. In the human world, if one group of people builds something and another group of people immediately begins to consume it, we call it vandalism or a labor strike, and we call in the militia. But in the Rock, the doozers want the Fraggles to eat their buildings. If the Fraggles didn't eat them, the caves would fill up with radish glass, and the doozers would run out of room to build. It is the ultimate symbiotic economy. It is a cycle of production and consumption that requires no money, no fine print, and no machine of the year to manage the ledgers. If the United States and the Soviet Union could find a way to eat each other's missiles, perhaps by making them out of chocolate or a particularly savory radish, the Cold War would be over by lunch. The Gorgs, the comedy of monarchy. Beyond the caves of the Fraggles lies the Garden of the Gorgs. These are giant, shaggy creatures who believe themselves to be the rulers of the universe. There is a king, a queen, and a prince named Junior who possesses the mental agility of a very confused ham. The Gorgs are a perfect satire of the divine right of kings. They claim ownership over everything they see, despite the fact that they are constantly outwitted by creatures a fraction of their size. They spend their days trying to catch Fraggles, whom they refer to as pests. Watching Junior Gorg chase a Fraggle reminded me of every interaction I've ever had with a government bureaucrat. There is a great deal of shouting, a fair amount of lumbering about, and in the end, the bureaucrat is left holding an empty net, while the pest is already back home singing a song about how delightful it is to be alive. The trash heap, the oracle of the refuse. When the Fraggles are in trouble, which is often as their primary survival strategy is hope for the best, they consult Marjorie the trash heap. Marjorie is exactly what she sounds like, a sentient pile of garbage located in the Gorg's garden. She is accompanied by two Philistines named Philo and Gunge, who act as her heralds. The Fraggles treat her with the reverence usually reserved for a Supreme Court justice or a very successful medium. "You are a pile of rubbish," I found myself shouting at the screen. But as I listened to her advice, I realized she was the only sane creature in the entire production. She understands that everything is connected. The garbage of today is the wisdom of tomorrow. She preaches a philosophy of you are me and I am you, and we are all part of the same compost. It is a humbling thought. We spend our lives trying to separate ourselves from the trash of the world, only to realize that we are all eventually going to end up in the same great bin. If the diplomats in Washington would spend more time consulting their local landfills and less time staring at their digital dashboards, the world might be a considerably more fragrant place, spiritually speaking. Postcards from outer space. The most poignant thread of the Fraggle Rock tapestry involves Uncle Travelin' Matt. Matt is an explorer who ventures out into outer space, which is what the Fraggles call the human world, and sends postcards back to his nephew, Gobo. I have spent a great deal of time in outer space myself, and I must say, Matt's descriptions are the most accurate I've ever encountered. He looks at a common object, like an umbrella or a vacuum cleaner, and sees it as a terrifying alien monster. He describes human behavior with a detached clinical confusion that I find immensely refreshing. "Dear Gobo," he writes, "the silly creatures of outer space spend their mornings standing in a line to receive a piece of paper, which they then trade for a brown liquid that makes them jittery. They call this civilization. I call it a very strange way to spend a Tuesday." Matt's postcards remind us that we are all silly creatures. To someone, we take ourselves so seriously with our machines of the year and our fiber optic threads, but to a 6-inch tall puppet with a tail, we are just clumsy giants who don't know how to dance properly. The Fraggle diplomacy. As I watched the final credits roll, I was struck by the theme song, a jaunty tune that invites the listener to dance your cares away and leave your troubles for another day. In the year 1983, troubles were the primary American export. We were worried about the Russians, we were worried about the computers, and we were worried about the color of our watches. But Fraggle Rock offered a different path. It suggested that the world is a series of interconnected rooms and that we all, doozers, fraggles, gorgs, and silly creatures, depend on one another to keep the lights on. The fraggles need the doozers for their snacks. The doozers need the fraggles for their space. The gorgs need the fraggles to feel important. And we silly creatures need them all to remind us that life is too short to be spent in a state of perpetual nuclear anxiety. I reckon that if we could just get Reagan and Andropov to sit down and watch 20 minutes of Fraggle Rock, they might realize that they are just two very large, very confused gorgs arguing over a garden that belongs to nobody. I have decided to adopt the Fraggle philosophy for the remainder of the year. I shall dance when possible, sing when prompted, and if I see a doozer building something, I shall do my best to eat it, provided it's made of something more digestible than radish dust. It is a far more sensible way to live than waiting for the day after. Let the machines have the magazines. I'll take the hole in the wall. It's much more crowded, but the music is significantly better. Chapter 9. The Motorola Brick, in which I encounter a telephone that doubles as a masonry tool and mourn the final death of solitude. For most of my natural life, the telephone was a sedentary beast. It was a wooden box bolted to the wall or a heavy black instrument tethered to a desk by a coiled umbilical cord of copper and rubber. It was a stationary tyrant. If the telephone rang, you had to go to it, much like a subject approaching a king to hear a royal decree, which was usually a request from one's mother-in-law to fetch a pound of sugar or a notification that your bill at the haberdashery was past due. The tether was a blessing in disguise. It meant that if you were not within 10 feet of that specific wall, you were, for all intents and purposes, a free man. You could wander into the garden, lose yourself in the woods, or hide in the cellar with a bottle of bourbon, and the world could not find you. You were out, a magnificent English word that meant you were the master of your own silence. But in the year of our Lord 1983, the gentleman at Motorola, a name that sounds like a brand of floor wax for a motor car, decided that human freedom was an oversight that needed to be corrected. They unveiled the Dynatasy 8000X. They called it a cellular radio telephone. I call it a handheld anchor, or perhaps the world's most expensive piece of beige masonry. The architecture of the weapon. When I first beheld the Dynatask, I did not think communication. I thought siege engine. It is a massive, rectangular slab of plastic, approximately the size and weight of a standard fire brick used in the construction of a Victorian chimney. It is 10 inches tall, not counting the rubberized antenna that juts from the top like a stiff black licorice stick. It weighs a full 2 pounds. I was handed the device by a salesman who wore a suit of such aggressive polyester that I feared he might spontaneously combust if he walked too quickly. "It's the first truly portable telephone, Mr. TwAIn," he beamed. "You can carry it anywhere." "My dear boy," I replied, "I could also carry a medium-sized sledgehammer anywhere, but I generally choose not to, as I have a lingering affection for the integrity of my spine. If I am to carry this object, do I also receive a small pack mule to assist me, or is the hump on my back included in the purchase price?" The thing is an aesthetic disaster. It is colored that particular shade of office beige that seems to be the official hue of the 1980s, a color that suggests the designers were inspired by a bowl of lukewarm oatmeal. It has a numeric keypad that clicks with a hollow plastic finality and a red LED display that looks like the eyes of a very tiny, very angry owl. The King's Ransom. Then we come to the matter of the price. The Dynatassi 8000X retails for the modest sum of $3,995. Let us pause and consider that figure. For $4,000 in my day, a man could buy a respectable farm, a fine team of horses, and enough whiskey to forget he owned either of them. In 1983, it is the price of a plastic box that allows you to talk to people who probably aren't worth $4,000 of your time in the first place. And the expenses do not end there. I am told that after you have sold your firstborn to purchase the device, you must then pay monthly fees and per-minute charges that would make a Gilded Age railroad tycoon blush. It is a brilliant business model. First, you sell a man a brick, and then you charge him every time he uses the brick to hit himself in the wallet. The 10-30 rule. The technical specifications of this marvel are even more hilarious than its price. The Dynatac possesses a battery that requires 10 hours of charging to provide exactly 30 minutes of conversation. It is the most inefficient ratio I have encountered since I tried to teach a parrot to recite the works of Shakespeare in exchange for crackers. You must tether the brick to a wall for the better part of a day just so you can walk down the street for half an hour and pretend to be an important man of business. What happens, I asked the salesman, if my conversation lasts 31 minutes? Does the machine explode? Does it melt into a puddle of beige goo? Or does it simply go silent, leaving me shouting into a plastic void like a man arguing with a tombstone? He informed me that the phone would simply die. A fitting term, I think. It is a device that spends 95% of its life in a state of clinical exhaustion, only to wake up for a brief, frantic window of social relevance before falling back into a coma. The death of the away. But the true horror of the Motorola brick is not its weight, its price, or its pathetic battery. It is the social catastrophe it portends. We are entering an era where no man is ever truly away. With a Dynatac strapped to your belt, an act that requires a belt made of reinforced steel, you are always reachable. You are always on the hook. Imagine, if you will, a world where you are walking through a quiet park, contemplating the majesty of the oaks and the gentle play of the light upon the grass. Suddenly, your hip begins to emit a shrill electronic chirp. It is your business partner. He wants to know if you have seen the latest figures on the pork belly market. In the old world, that partner would have had to wait until you returned to your office. He would have had time to reconsider his question, and you would have had time to enjoy your walk. But now, the silicon steamboat has caught up to you in the woods. The office has followed you into the sanctuary of the trees. We are trading our solitude for accessibility, and I fear we are getting the short end of the stick. A man who is always reachable is a man who is never truly himself. He is merely a node in a network, a cog in a machine that never stops turning. The status symbol of the shouting man. Despite its many flaws, the brick has become the ultimate status symbol of 1983. I see them in the hands of yuppies, a new breed of human that appears to subsist entirely on brie cheese and ambition. They carry their bricks into restaurants and place them on the table with a thud that rattles the silverware. They do not use them to talk. They use them to broadcast. There is a peculiar psychological phenomenon associated with the cellular phone, the cellular shout. Because the user is aware that the signal is traveling through the air via invisible cells and radio towers, he feels the need to shout his conversation at the top of his lungs, as if he is trying to help the voice reach its destination. "Yes, Harvey, I'm at the cafe." "The cafe? No, the one with the umbrellas. Did you sell the shares? Sell them! Sell them all!" The entire restaurant is now a witness to Harvey's financial ruin. It is a magnificent display of ego. The brick allows a man to turn his private business into a public performance, forcing everyone within a 50-foot radius to participate in his life, whether they wish to or not. It is the death of modesty and the birth of a new kind of electronic narcissism. The future of the brick. The engineers tell me that one day these phones will be smaller. They say they will be as thin as a wafer and as light as a feather. They say they will have color screens and will be able to send electronic mail. I do not doubt them. After seeing a plastic box named Man of the Year, I am prepared to believe anything. But whether the phone is a 2-pound brick or a 2-ounce sliver, the fundamental problem remains. We are building a world where we can never be alone. As for me, I shall decline the offer to purchase a Dynatac. I have enough trouble keeping track of my spectacles and my umbrella. I have no desire to add a $4,000 beige brick to my inventory of things to lose. If you wish to reach me, you may write me a letter. If it is urgent, you may send a telegram. And if you simply must speak to me immediately, you may walk to my front door and knock. If I am in, I shall be delighted to see you, and if I am away, you may take comfort in the fact that I am somewhere the wires cannot reach, enjoying the one luxury that money, even $4,000 of it, cannot buy, a moment of peace. Chapter 10. The Final M-A-S-H, in which an entire nation holds its collective breath and the New York sewage system faces its greatest trial since the invention of the hot dog. I have always been of the opinion that the human race is never so united as when it is collectively attempting to avoid its responsibilities. In my day, if you wanted to see a mass gathering of souls, you looked for a hanging, a revival meeting, or a steamboat race where the boilers were considered suggestive of an explosion. But in February of 1983, I witnessed a phenomenon that defied all the laws of social physics. On the evening of the 28th, a strange and eerie silence fell over the Republic. The streets of New York were as empty as a politician's promise. The taverns were hushed. Even the stray dogs of Hannibal seemed to pause in their pursuit of the neighborhood cats. 106 million people, a number so vast that if you lined them up hand to hand, they would wrap around the earth and still have enough left over to form a very respectable queue for a pie-eating contest, sat down in front of their glowing glass boxes. They were not there to hear a declaration of war or the news of a gold strike. They were there to say goodbye to a group of fictional doctors who had been practicing medicine in a muddy corner of Korea for 11 years, roughly 8 years longer than the actual war they were purportedly fighting. The temporal paradox of television. I find it a magnificent irony that the American public possesses the attention span of a startled gnat when it comes to actual history, yet exhibits the stoic endurance of a granite cliff when it comes to serialized drama. The Korean conflict, I am told, lasted from 1950 to 1953. It was a sharp, bitter, and bloody affair that the history books tend to treat as a sort of intermission between the Second World War and the various cultural catastrophes of the 60s. And yet, the television program MASH began in 1972 and did not strike its tents until 1983. "My dear fellow," I said to a man wearing a Hawkeye T-shirt, "do you realize that these doctors have been treating the same 3-year war for over a decade? By now, the patients should be old enough to have grandchildren, and the surgeons should be retired to a comfortable porch in Connecticut." "It's not about the war, Mr. TwAIn," he replied with a misty look in his eye. "It's about the family." Ah, the family. In the modern age, if you spend enough time with a group of colored lights on a screen, they become more real to you than your own second cousins. We have invented a world where we can mourn the departure of a fictional surgeon named Pierce more deeply than we mourn the passing of our local tax assessor. Though, to be fair, I have never met a tax assessor whose departure wasn't a cause for quiet celebration. The martini as a philosophical tool. I must confess a certain admiration for the protagonist of this long-running wake, Captain Hawkeye Pierce. He is a man after my own heart, a creature of dry wit, a profound distaste for the military mind, and a medicinal reliance on the martini. The doctors of the 4077th operated a still in their tent. In my era, if you were caught operating a still in a military camp, you were generally invited to a very formal court-martial. But in the 4077th, the still was the very center of their moral universe. It was a protest against the madness of the world. There is a great deal of Mark Twain in that tent, I think. We both understand that when the world goes mad, when men in shiny hats decide that the best way to resolve a dispute is to turn a perfectly good field into a cemetery, the only sane response is a well-timed joke and a very cold drink. Laughter is the only thing that can survive the meatball surgery of existence. If you can find the humor in a surgical tent, you can survive anything the silicon steamboat throws at you. The 3-hour wake. The final episode, titled Goodbye, Farewell, and Amen, lasted 2.5 hours, or 3 hours if you include the various solicitations for insurance and floor wax. It was a marathon of sentimentality. I watched as the characters I had come to know, against my better judgment, prepared to depart. There was Father Mulcahy, a man of the cloth who seemed to find God primarily in the midst of chaos. There was Klinger, who had spent a decade trying to prove he was insane by wearing women's hats, only to realize that in a war, a man in a dress is often the most rational person in the room. And there was Colonel Potter, who possessed the weary dignity of a man who has seen too many Machine of the Year winners come and go. The Americans, I have observed, love a long goodbye. We are a people who cannot simply shake hands and part ways. We must have a ceremony, a retrospective, a musical interlude, and at least 4 emotional breakdowns before we are willing to leave the room. By the second hour of the finale, the air in the living rooms of America was thick with the scent of salty tears and microwave popcorn. It was a national wake for a war that had been over for 30 years, and for a decade the 70s, that was finally being escorted to the door by the neon-lit bouncers of the 80s. The great flush of 83. But the most fascinating aspect of the MASH finale was not what happened on the screen, but what happened in the pipes. I am told by the city engineers, men who view the world through the lens of hydraulic pressure and waste management, that when the final credits began to roll at approximately 11 o'clock, the city of New York experienced a catastrophic drop in water pressure. Why? Because 106 million people had spent 2.5 hours holding their bladders in a state of suspended animation, afraid to miss a single goodbye or a final farewell. The moment the end appeared on the screen, the entire population of the eastern seaboard rose as one and marched to the smallest room in the house. It was the Great Flush. I find this a magnificent metaphor for the television age. We spend hours absorbing the digital dreams of the networks, filling our heads with the dramas and comedies of strangers, only to be reminded at the end of the night that we are still biological creatures with very earthly requirements. 100 million souls united by a common emotion, and then immediately united by a common plumbing necessity. It is the ultimate democratic leveling. The shadow of the Korean War. As the screen finally went dark, I found myself reflecting on the shadow of the Korean War. MASH was, for all its humor, a protest against the Vietnam War, disguised as a comedy about a previous conflict. It allowed the American people to process their grief and their anger through a filter of 30 years ago. By 1983, the wounds of Vietnam were still fresh, even as we moved into the cold bites of the Reagan era. MASH provided a bridge. It told us that even in the worst of times, even when the missiles are in the silos and the machine of the year is watching our every move, there is still a place for compassion, for friendship, and for a very dry martini. But it also marked the end of the shared experience. In the Silicon Steamboat of the future, I am told there will be hundreds of channels. There will be cable and satellites and home video. Never again will half the nation sit down together to watch the same thing at the same time. We are splintering into 1,000 different tents, each with our own tiny stills and our own private jokes. A final salute. I shall miss the 4077th. Not because I have a fondness for hospitals. I have spent enough time in the company of doctors to know that their primary skill is waiting for nature to do the work and then taking the credit, but because they represented a certain kind of human resilience. They proved that you can keep your soul in the midst of a slaughterhouse, provided you have a sharp tongue and a loyal friend. As the helicopter carrying Hawkeye Pierce rose over the word goodbye, written in stones on a Korean hillside, I felt a strange pang of melancholy. The Gilded Age had its grand balls and its railroad empires. The 80s have their Motorola bricks and their fiber optic threads. But for a few hours in February of 83, the world stopped its frantic march toward the future and looked back. We said goodbye to a show, but we were really saying goodbye to the idea that a war could be understood, or that a long goodbye could ever truly be enough. I think I shall go and find a martini, not because I am in a surgical tent, but because I have just witnessed the largest funeral in the history of the world, and my throat is dry from the dust of 11 years of television memories. And if you'll excuse me, I should probably check the water pressure. I suspect the rest of the neighborhood is currently engaged in their own final salute to the New York sewage system. Chapter 11. The Birth of the Minivan, in which I encounter a box on wheels and realize the American frontier has been reduced to a parking lot. In my youth, if a man possessed a desire to move his family, his worldly goods, and a weary-looking hunting dog across the vast, unforgiving expanse of the American continent, he required a team of oxen, a wagon covered in sturdy canvas, and a constitutional resistance to dysentery. We called these vessels prairie schooners. They were slow, they were drafty, and they possessed the suspension of a falling anvil. But they had a certain rugged dignity. They were the chariots of destiny, carving ruts into the earth that would eventually become the foundations of empires. But as I navigate the paved and manicured wilderness of 1983, I find that the pioneer spirit has undergone a most domestic transformation. The modern American does not wish to conquer the Rockies or navigate the Great Divide. He wishes to conquer the local shopping mall and navigate the treacherous geography of a school carpool. To facilitate this new low-stakes heroism, a gentleman named Lee Iacocca, a man who possesses the silver tongue of a riverboat gambler and the eyebrows of an Old Testament prophet, has unveiled the Chrysler T115. The world calls it the minivan. I call it the suburban breadbox, and I suspect it is the final nail in the coffin of American adventure. The prophet of the parking lot. One cannot speak of the minivan without speaking of Mr. Iacocca. He is the chairman of Chrysler, a company that was, until recently, as insolvent as a poet in a drought. I watched him on the television, that glowing glass eye I have come to loathe and admire in equal measure. He pointed a finger at the audience and dared them to find a better car. "If you can find a better car," he barked, "buy it. It is a magnificent piece of humbug. It is the same logic used by the man selling Miracle Hair Tonic at the county fair. He knows perfectly well you haven't the time or the inclination to check the ingredients of every bottle in the state. Iacocca realized that the American people were tired of the station wagon, that long wood-paneled leviathan that handled like a wet mattress and required a harbor pilot to park. He realized that what the public truly desired was a vehicle that had the soul of a bus, but the footprint of a sedan. He gave them a box, a glorious beige fiberglass box. The architecture of the domestic sled. I went to a local dealership to inspect this Plymouth Voyager, a name that implies a journey to the South Seas, though I suspect its most frequent destination is the dry cleaners. The design of the minivan is a triumph of utility over art. It possesses the aerodynamics of a brick wall that has been slightly sanded at the edges. While the Corvette I inspected in Bowling Green was shaped like a wedge of cheese designed to slice through the wind, the minivan is shaped like the box the cheese came in. It's about interior volume, Mr. TwAIn, the salesman informed me. He was a man who looked like he had been born wearing a short-sleeved dress shirt. Interior volume, I mused. In my day, we called that room. And if you wanted more of it, you simply built a bigger house. You didn't try to drive your living room down the highway at 60 miles an hour. The most striking feature of this contraption is the sliding door. It is a mechanical marvel that allows the side of the car to vanish, revealing a cavernous interior filled with rows of seats. It reminded me of the gangplank of a steamboat, though I noticed a distressing lack of safety railings. "It's perfect for the children," the salesman beamed. "Indeed," I replied. "It is a guillotine for fingers, disguised as a convenience. I can already hear the chorus of wailing youngsters as their digits are introduced to the relentless logic of a sliding steel track." The luxury of the simulated. Once inside, I was struck by the sheer abundance of simulated materials. The 1980s, I have concluded, is the age of the fake. The wood. The exterior of some models features wood grain panels. I touch them. They are not wood, they are stickers, glorious adhesive-backed photographs of a tree that never existed, applied to a piece of metal by a machine in Detroit. It is a tribute to our nostalgia for the forest, delivered via the magic of petroleum products. The carpet. The floor is covered in a shag material that feels like the fur of a synthetic sheep that died of embarrassment. The cup holders. And here, dear Rita, we find the pinnacle of human achievement. The minivan features cup holders. I sat in the driver's seat and stared at the plastic indentation. "So," I said to the salesman, "the primary concern of the modern traveler is no longer the condition of the road, the direction of the wind, or the proximity of the nearest watering hole. It is the stability of his coffee." "It's a lifestyle feature, sir," he said, "a lifestyle feature. We have become a nation of people who cannot travel 3 miles to the post office without a hot beverage secured in a plastic cradle. The pioneers of the Oregon Trail managed to cross 3,000 miles of wilderness with nothing but a tin cup and a sense of impending doom. But the modern pioneer of 1983 requires a spill-proof environment to survive the trip to the grocery store. The suburban prairie schooner. As I watched a young mother load 3 children and a week's worth of groceries into the back of a Voyager, I realized that Iacocca had tapped into a profound truth. The American frontier has moved. It is no longer west. It is out. It is the suburbs, a landscape of identical houses, manicured lawns, and a silence so profound it makes a graveyard look like a riot. In this new wilderness, the minivan is indeed the prairie schooner. It is designed to haul the modern equivalents of gold and cattle, soccer balls, grocery bags, and a brood of children who are currently being raised by the machine of the year. The mother didn't care about horsepower or aerodynamics. She cared that she could stand up in the back to settle an argument between her offspring without having to pull over. She cared that the grocery bags wouldn't tip over. She cared that the car was an extension of her home, a mobile fortress that protected her family from the dangers of the outside world, which in 1983 mostly consisted of bad weather and the occasional slow-moving mail truck. The death of the road. There is a sadness in the minivan, however. It marks the final domestication of the road. When you drive a station wagon, you are still driving a car. You are still connected to the machine. But when you drive a minivan, you are merely moving a room from one location to another. The road is no longer a place of adventure. It is a chore. It is a commute. It is a necessary evil that must be endured while you listen to the radio and sip your stabilized coffee. We have traded the romance of the journey for the comfort of the destination. We have built a vehicle that is so sensible, so practical, and so utterly devoid of spirit that it makes a church pew look like a roller coaster. Iacocca's Revenge. Lee Iacocca saved Chrysler with this box. He turned a bankrupt company into a profit-making machine by betting that the American people had finally given up on the dream of the open road and were ready to settle for the open hatch. He was right, of course. The minivan is a runaway success. By the end of this year, they will be as common as dandelions on a suburban lawn. Every driveway will host a beige box, and every highway will be clogged with voyagers who never leave the county. As for me, I shall remain a skeptic. If I am to travel, I want to feel the wind in my face and the vibration of the engine in my bones. I want a vehicle that looks like it's going somewhere, not one that looks like it's waiting for a delivery of laundry. I shall stick to the old ways. Give me a horse, give me a steamboat, or give me a train that smells of coal and destiny. You can keep your cup holders and your sliding doors. I may get mud on my boots and coffee on my shirt, but at least I'll know I've been on a journey and not just a carpool. But I must give credit where it's due. Iacocca is a genius. He sold the American people a bus and convinced them it was a magic wagon. If he'd been around in my day, he'd have had the pioneers paying extra for simulated canvas on their wagons and a stabilized holder for their buffalo water. Chapter 12. GPS for the Masses. In which the heavens are populated by metal spies, and the romance of getting lost is officially executed by an act of Congress. I have always held that the greatest privilege of a gentleman is the right to be entirely and hopelessly lost. In my years on the Mississippi, getting lost was not an error. It was a professional necessity. The river, you see, is a shifty character. It moves its sandbars like a shell game operator moves a pea. It hides its snags under a cloak of silver ripples, and it possesses a most distressing habit of shortening its own length by cutting through a neck of land while you are busy having a nap. To navigate such a creature, a pilot required a sharp eye, a long memory, and a lead line to feel the bottom. If you found yourself in a stretch of water you didn't recognize, you didn't consult a mechanical oracle. You simply steered toward the nearest light, hoped it wasn't a tavern with a bad reputation, and called it an exploration. But in the autumn of 1983, the Silicon Steamboat received a new kind of compass, one that does not reside on the deck, but in the very vault of the heavens. The tragedy of the wrong turn. The catalyst for this celestial intrusion was a tragedy of the most somber sort. In September, a civilian airliner, Korean Airlines Flight 007, took a wrong turn on its way to Seoul and blundered into the airspace of the Soviet Union. The Soviets, who possess the hospitality of a cornered rattlesnake and a nervous system tuned to the frequency of total paranoia, decided that the passenger plane was a spy vessel and promptly shot it out of the sky. It was a grim reminder that in the Cold War, a simple mistake in geography can be a capital offense. President Reagan, a man who understands that the best way to win a fight is to change the rules of the game, looked up at the sky and made a decree. He announced that the Global Positioning System, GPS, a network of satellites built by the military to ensure their missiles hit the correct chimney, would henceforth be opened to the civilian world. From now on, the government whispered, no one shall ever have an excuse for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The constellations of the Pentagon. I find the architecture of this system to be a piece of humbug on a cosmic scale. We have spent thousands of years navigating by the stars, the honest, twinkling diamonds that the Almighty scattered across the velvet of the night. Those stars are free. They require no batteries, no subscription fees, and they don't care if you're a king or a pickpocket. But the stars of 1983 are different. They are made of aluminum and solar panels. They are called Navstar satellites, and they circle the Earth like a pack of mechanical wolves, constantly whispering their locations to anyone with a receiver large enough to catch the signal. I asked a scientist how it works. "It's simple, Mr. TwAIn," he said. "The satellites send down a time stamp. Your receiver calculates the distance to 4 different satellites simultaneously, and through a process of trilateration, determines exactly where you are standing." "Exactly?" I asked. "Within a few meters," he beamed. I was horrified. "My dear boy," I said, "if a man knows where he is within a few meters, he has lost the capacity for surprise. He has turned the entire planet into a well-lit hallway. Where is the mystery? Where is the adventure? If Christopher Columbus had possessed a GPS, he would have arrived in the Bahamas and complained that the local tavern wasn't where the map said it should be." The death of the dead reckoning. In my era, we practiced dead reckoning. It is a magnificent term, implying that if your reckoning is wrong, you will shortly be dead. It required a man to use his brain. You looked at the current, you calculated your speed, you noted the position of the North Star, and you made an educated guess. It was an art form, but GPS turns navigation into a clerical task. It is living reckoning, or perhaps lazy reckoning. The machine does the thinking for you. It tells you that you are at exactly 41.5 degrees latitude and 90.5 degrees longitude. What does that mean to a human soul? Nothing. It is a set of cold digital coordinates. It doesn't tell you that the mud is soft, that the mosquitoes are biting, or that there is a fine piece of blackberry pie waiting for you in the next town. It only tells you where you are on a grid. We are turning the world into a giant graph paper nightmare, and we are the dots. The eye in the sky. There is also the matter of privacy, a concept that seems to be going out of style as fast as the horse and buggy. With GPS, the government is essentially keeping a permanent eye in the sky. They say it is for our safety. They say it is so we don't wander into Russia by mistake. But I suspect that the Silicon Steamboat is becoming a bit of a snitch. If a satellite knows where you are, then the people who own the satellite know where you are. I have spent a lifetime avoiding people who wanted to know exactly where I was, mostly creditors, editors, and various relatives with investment opportunities. The idea that a metal box in space is tracking my progress across the Earth is enough to make a man want to wear a lead hat. "Is it watching me now?" I asked the scientist, glancing nervously at the ceiling. "Technically, sir, it's just broadcasting. It doesn't see you." "Ah," I replied, That is what the spider tells the fly just before the broadcasting of the web begins. The Great Civilian Migration. As the year 1983 draws to a close, the commercialization of GPS has begun in earnest. Of course, the receivers currently cost about as much as a small hotel and are roughly the size of a steamer trunk. But the precedent has been set. One day, I am told, these things will be built into the dashboards of our minivans. They will talk to us. They will say, "In 200 yards, turn left." Imagine the indignity. To have a plastic box with the voice of a school marm telling a grown man which way to turn. It is the final victory of the machine of the year. We have handed over the steering wheel of our lives to a constellation of military hardware. We are becoming a race of people who can travel around the globe without ever actually looking out the window. Why look at the landmarks when the screen tells you everything you need to know? We are navigating by bits and pixels, and in doing so, we are losing our feel for the earth. The irony of finding yourself. The moderns are obsessed with finding themselves. They go to retreats, they read philosophy, and they stare at their navels in search of meaning, and now they have a satellite to help them do it. But I suspect that finding yourself is much easier when you have the option of being lost. It is only when the map fails, when the lights go out and the path disappears, that a man truly discovers what he is made of. Adventure is the space between where you are and where you thought you were. By filling that space with GPS, we are making the world safer. Certainly, we are preventing tragedies like Flight 007, but we are also making the world smaller. We are removing the unknown from the map and replacing it with a series of predictable, calculated turns. A final salute to the fog. As I sit on the banks of the river, watching a thick fog roll in from the Illinois side, I feel a strange sense of relief. The fog is the one thing the satellites cannot penetrate. Inside that white blanket, the GPS might know my coordinates, but it doesn't know me. In the fog, I am still the master of my own confusion. I can imagine that I am anywhere, on the Amazon, on the Thames, or on a river that hasn't even been named yet. I don't need a time stamp from a Navstar to tell me I'm alive. I can feel the dampness on my skin and hear the muffled tolling of a distant bell. Reagan may have opened the heavens to the masses, and the Silicon Steamboat may have its digital compass. But I shall keep my lead line and my intuition. Let the satellites watch the world. I'll be the one in the fog, enjoying the last great luxury of the 19th century, the sheer magnificent joy of not having the faintest idea where I'm going. And if I do end up in Russia, well, I've always wanted to see if their cigars are as formidable as their novelists. I'll just tell them I'm a civilian explorer who forgot to change the batteries in his machine of the year. Chapter 13, The Compact Disc Debut, in which music is canned like peaches, etched by lightning, and stripped of its honest human frailty. I have always been a man who appreciates a good noise, provided it is produced by an instrument I can see and a person I can reasonably expect to pay for their dinner. In my youth, if you wanted music, you had to wait for a traveling fiddler, a church choir, or a riverboat calliope that sounded like a steam engine having a religious epiphany. Sound was a physical thing. You could feel the floorboards vibrate under the thump of a boot, and you could see the sweat on the brow of the banjo player. When Mr. Edison invented the phonograph, I thought we had reached the pinnacle of auditory thievery. We had managed to trap a human voice in a wax cylinder, a feat of humbug so spectacular it made the miracles of the Bible look like card tricks. Later, we moved to the vinyl record, a great black pancake of a thing that possessed a needle and a groove. It was an honest machine. If a bit of dust settled in the groove, the music would hop and skip like a startled frog, reminding you that you were listening to a physical object subject to the laws of a dusty universe. But in the spring of 1983, the Silicon Steamboat delivered a new kind of auditory cargo to the shores of the Republic. It is called the compact disc, or the CD, for those who find two-syllable words a taxing mental exercise. It is a silver, rainbow-hued donut that promises perfect sound forever, a slogan that I find as suspicious as a politician's absolute guarantee. The architecture of the silver donut. I encountered my first CD in a shop in New York, a place where the air was thick with the scent of electricity and the desperation of people trying to be modern. The clerk handed me a plastic jewel case, another grand name for a box that is remarkably difficult to open without the use of a hammer or a very sharp tongue. Inside was the disc itself. It is a 4 3/4-inch platter of polycarbonate plastic, coated in a layer of aluminum that reflects the light with a shimmering iridescent glow. It looks like a fishing lure for a very sophisticated trout, I remarked. "It's digital, Mr. TwAIn," the clerk replied, his eyes glazing over with the fervor of a convert. The music is etched into it by a laser in a series of pits and lands. "A laser?" I asked. "I have heard of lasers. They are the weapons of choice for the mechanical men in the motion pictures I've seen. The idea of using a concentrated beam of angry light to play a Mozart concerto strikes me as a bit like using a Gatling gun to swat a fly. It is a prodigious amount of technology to apply to a simple melody." The digital deception. The clerk proceeded to explain the concept of digital audio. It seems that the music is no longer a continuous wave of sound like the flowing current of the Mississippi. Instead, it has been chopped up into millions of tiny pieces, zeros and ones, and turned into data. "You see, sir," the lad explained, "the machine reads the numbers and reconstructs the sound. There is no hiss, there is no pop, there is no scratch." I found this deeply unsettling. A world without hiss or pop is a world that has been scrubbed too clean for comfort. In my experience, anything that claims to be perfect is usually lying about its pedigree. The hiss of a record is the sound of reality. It is the friction of the world. By turning music into a series of numbers, we are stripping away the soul of the vibration. If you take a beautiful woman and describe her entirely in terms of her height, weight, and the chemical composition of her hair, you have data, but you certainly don't have a woman. The CD treats a symphony like a ledger at a counting house. It is a mathematical approximation of beauty, and I have never known a mathematician who could carry a tune in a bucket. The indestructible humbug. The marketing gentlemen of 1983 are particularly fond of claiming that the compact disc is indestructible. They tell us that, unlike the fragile vinyl record, the CD can be handled with reckless abandon. They claim you can smear it with jam, step on it, or use it as a coaster for your gin and tonic, and the laser will still find the music. I decided to test this theory, mentally at least. I have seen what happens when the human race is told something is indestructible. It is a challenge we cannot ignore. If you tell an American a box is unbreakable, he will immediately find a cliff to throw it off. I suspect that within a year, the perfect sound forever will be interrupted by the perfect scratch forever. The plastic is shiny, and shiny things attract fingerprints like a honeypot attracts bears. And once that laser encounters a smudge of thumb grease or a bit of suburban grit, I predict the machine will behave like a nervous debutante at a ball. It will stutter, skip, and eventually collapse in a heap of digital confusion. The $1,000 entry fee. Then there is the matter of the CD player. To hear this perfect sound, one must purchase a machine that costs approximately $1,000. For $1,000 in 1870, you could buy a respectable house, a decent library, and still have enough left over to bribe a local magistrate. In 1983, it is the price of a silver box that does nothing but spin a plastic donut. The first players, the Sony CDP-101 and its brethren, are heavy black monoliths that possess more buttons than a general's dress uniform. They have search functions, program modes, and digital displays that count down the seconds with a cold, relentless precision. "Why must I know how many seconds are left in the song?" I asked the clerk. "Does the music not end when it is finished? Do we now experience art as a countdown to a deadline?" "It's for convenience, sir." Ah, convenience, the great god of the 20th century. We will pay any price and sacrifice any amount of dignity to avoid the labor of standing up and moving a needle across a record. We are becoming a race of people who want our beauty delivered to us by a machine that requires no more effort than the pressing of a button. The long box absurdity. I must also comment on the long box. To sell these tiny discs in stores designed for 12-inch records, the industry has decided to package the jewel case inside a long, skinny cardboard box. It is a masterpiece of waste. It is a 12-inch box for a 5-inch disc. It is as if I were to sell my books in a case the size of a steamer trunk, just so the bookseller wouldn't have to adjust his shelves. It is a tribute to the stubbornness of commerce. We have invented a compact medium, and then we have gone to great lengths to make it uncompact for the sake of the retail display. It is the sort of logic that would make a riverboat pilot turn to drink. The death of the warmth. As the clerk finally played a disc for me, a recording of Billy Joel, I believe, I stood and listened. The sound was, indeed, very clear. It was as sharp as a new razor and as cold as a winter morning in Duluth. But I missed the warmth. The moderns call it fidelity, but I call it sterility. The CD removes the air from the music. It is like looking at a photograph of a steak instead of eating the steak itself. You can see all the details, but you can't smell the charcoal or taste the juice. We are moving into an era where our sensory experiences are being processed. Our news is processed by fiber optics. Our time is processed by quartz. And now our music is being processed by lasers. We are surrounding ourselves with digital intermediaries that promise us perfection, but deliver a hollowed-out version of reality. A final note on the silver rainbow. As I left the shop, I looked back at the display of silver discs. They were beautiful in a cold celestial sort of way. They are the artifacts of a civilization that has mastered the pit and the land, but has forgotten how to sit in a room and listen to the silence between the notes. I shall keep my records. I like the scratch. I like the hiss. I like the fact that if I drop my favorite album, it will break. It reminds me that beauty is a fragile thing that must be handled with care. A perfect sound forever is a terrifying prospect. It implies that nothing ever changes, nothing ever ages, and nothing ever dies. And as a man who has spent a lifetime watching the river change its course every morning, I can tell you that forever is a very long time to listen to the same digital numbers. Give me the banjo, give me the piano, and give me the honest, dusty vibration of a needle in a groove. Let the silicon steamboat keep its silver donuts. I prefer my music to have a little bit of the river mud still clinging to it. Chapter 14. The Return of the Jedi, in which I encounter a giant slug, a gold-plated pedant, and a tribe of teddy bears with a taste for imperial soldiers. In the merry month of May, 1983, a strange and frantic madness gripped the youth of the Republic, a madness that made the religious revivals of my youth look like a quiet afternoon at a library. It seemed that the entire population had decided to abandon their homes and places of business to stand in a line that stretched from the theater door to the next county. They were waiting to see the conclusion of a space opera titled The Return of the Jedi. I asked a young man in the queue why he had been standing on the pavement for 48 hours to see a moving picture. "It's the end of the trilogy, man," he exclaimed, his eyes bloodshot from a lack of sleep and an excess of anticipation. "We have to know if Luke saves Vader or if the Empire wins." "My dear boy," I replied, "in my day, if a man spent 48 hours standing on a street corner to see a Jedi, we didn't give him a ticket. We gave him a cold compress and a lecture on the virtues of steady employment. Is this George Lucas a prophet or a huckster?" "Both," the lad whispered, with the reverence of a monk. Naturally, I purchased a ticket. I have always had a weakness for grand-scale humbug, and I wished to see how the silicon steamboat of Hollywood intended to wrap up a story that had already cost more than the Louisiana Purchase. The Sultan of Slime, Jabba the Hutt. The spectacle begins in a desert, a place called TwAIn, which appears to be a planet-sized version of Nevada, but with more aliens and fewer silver mines. We are introduced to a creature called Jabba the Hutt. Jabba is a magnificent creation. He is a giant bloated slug with the temperament of a corrupt Tammany Hall politician and the physical grace of a landslide. He sits upon a dais, surrounded by a court of sycophants, freaks, and a small, laughing rat creature that I found surprisingly relatable. Jabba represents the very pinnacle of the Gilded Age tycoon. He accumulates wealth, he enslaves his enemies in carbonite, a process of freezing a man in a block of gray gunk that reminds me of being trapped in a particularly dull board meeting, and he keeps a giant monster in his basement to dispose of his critics. I have known many editors who possessed similar facilities, though they usually lacked the monster. The rescue of Han Solo from Jabba's palace is a marvel of pyrotechnics and confusion. There is a sarlacc pit, a hole in the sand filled with teeth that digests its victims over 1,000 years. I found this an excellent metaphor for the American legal system. Once you fall in, the process is agonizingly slow, and by the time you're finished, you've forgotten why you were there in the first place. The return of the mechanical pedant. And then there are the mechanical men. I have previously expressed my skepticism regarding the machine of the year, but George Lucas has populated his universe with robots that possess more personality and more neuroses than the average human. There is C-3PO, a gold-plated gentleman who appears to have been programmed with the anxiety of a nervous ant and the linguistic precision of a dictionary. He spends the entire film complaining about his circuits and expressing a profound desire to be elsewhere. I felt a great deal of sympathy for him. If I were a golden robot being dragged through a desert by a group of space wizards, I too would be concerned about my internal wiring. Then there is R2-D2, a machine that looks like a fire hydrant with a college education. He communicates in a series of beeps and whistles that everyone seems to understand perfectly. "What did he say?" I asked a child in the seat next to me. "He said the shield generator is still active, sir." "Fascinating," I replied. "In my day, a fire hydrant that spoke was a sign that you had spent too much time in the company of a whiskey bottle. Here, it is a vital member of the rebellion." The Ewok controversy, teddy bears with spears. But the true revelation of the return of the Jedi occurs on the forest moon of Endor. It is here that we meet the Ewoks. Imagine, if you will, a tribe of 3-foot-tall teddy bears that have been crossed with a particularly aggressive breed of terrier. They live in trees, they speak in a language of chirps, and they possess a taste for human flesh, or at least a willingness to rotisserie a space smuggler for dinner. The climax of the film involves these fuzzy creatures taking on the Galactic Empire, a military force equipped with laser cannons, walking tanks, and the finest white plastic armor in the galaxy. And how do the Ewoks win? Do they use the silicon steamboat technology? Do they use the Force? No, they use rocks and sticks. I sat in the dark theater and roared with laughter. It was a magnificent satire of the modern world. The Empire has spent billions of credits on their Death Star and their AT-ST walkers, but they are utterly defeated by a group of stuffed animals with some well-placed logs. It is a reminder that no matter how much information you have, and no matter how many machines of the year you build, you can still be taken down by a primitive soul with a good throwing arm and a lack of respect for authority. I suspect the Ewoks were included to sell toys to the children of 1983, but I choose to see them as a tribute to the old world. They are the ultimate Luddites, proving that a sharp stick and a stout heart are still the most effective tools in the universe. The family business, a galactic feud. At the heart of this space opera is a family feud that would make the Hatfields and the McCoys look like a sewing circle. We have Luke Skywalker, a young man who has finally grown a chin and a sense of purpose, and his father, Darth Vader, a man who wears a black bucket on his head and breathes like a steam engine with a head cold. The final confrontation takes place in the throne room of the Emperor, a gentleman who looks like a piece of dried fruit that has been left in the sun for too long and possesses the fashion sense of a very gloomy monk. He spends his time cackling and encouraging Luke to give in to his anger. "He sounds like my first publisher," I remarked to the darkness. The resolution of the conflict, Vader's sudden change of heart, and his decision to toss his boss down a very deep hole is a moment of high drama. It suggests that even the most mechanical, black-hearted scoundrel has a sliver of humanity buried deep beneath his circuits. It is a comforting thought, though I suspect it would be harder to achieve if the boss weren't currently shooting lightning out of his fingers. The merchandising steamboat. As I exited the theater, blinking in the bright May sunshine, I was struck by a realization. George Lucas is not just a filmmaker. He is the captain of the most successful merchandising steamboat in history. Outside the theater, there were shops filled with action figures, bed sheets, lunchboxes, and Ewok plushes. The Silicon Steamboat of 1983 is not just about the screen. It is about the stuff. We have turned a story about a spiritual quest into a multi-billion-dollar garage sale. We are a nation that loves a good story, but we love owning the story even more. We want to take the Jedi home with us. We want to sleep in the Death Star. We want to eat our sandwiches out of a box decorated with the face of a golden robot. A final thought on the trilogy. The Return of the Jedi marks the end of an era. It is the final hurrah for a generation that grew up on the romance of the stars. It is a grand, noisy, colorful, and utterly absurd conclusion to a trilogy that captured the imagination of the world. Lucas has given us a myth for the digital age. He has replaced the river with the Force, the pilot with the Jedi, and the steamboat with the Millennium Falcon. It is the same old story, the struggle of the small against the great, the individual against the machine, but it is dressed up in the finest special effects that 1983 has to offer. I enjoyed the film, despite my skepticism. I enjoyed the giant slug, the golden pedant, and especially the teddy bears. They reminded me that even in a world of fiber optics and GPS, we still need our monsters and our heroes. We still need to believe that a young man from a farm can change the world and that a black-hearted villain can find his way home. And as I walked back to my hotel, I found myself whistling the theme music. It is a stirring tune, a melody that makes a man want to buy a cape and find a laser sword of his own. But then I remembered that I'm a man of the 19th century, and my only laser sword is my pen. I think I shall stick to the pen. It doesn't require the Force, it doesn't hum, and I don't have to worry about it accidentally cutting off my own hand if I have a bit too much whiskey at dinner. But for George Lucas and his Jedi, I tip my hat. It was a hell of a show. Chapter 15, The Mario Brothers Pipes, in which I observe the great digital sewer of progress and wonder why the youth of America is paying to practice a trade. I have spent a considerable portion of my life observing the American male in his natural state, which is to say, in a state of elaborate and expensive procrastination. In my day, if a boy wished to avoid his chores, he would go to the river to jump frogs, or perhaps organize a whitewashing syndicate that would make a Wall Street financier weep with admiration. These were honest, outdoor distractions that required nothing more than a bit of imagination and a sturdy set of lungs. But in 1983, I have discovered a new and terrifying species of recreation. It is found in a place called the arcade, a darkened, neon-lit cavern that smells of stale popcorn and the frantic perspiration of adolescence. In these dens of digital iniquity, the youth of the Republic stand transfixed before glowing altars, feeding silver quarters into machines that offer them the opportunity to pretend they are Italian plumbers. I am speaking, of course, of Mario Brothers. It is a spectacle of such profound absurdity that I found myself compelled to lean against a nearby Pac-Man machine and contemplate the total collapse of Western civilization. The plumbing of the soul. Consider, if you will, the premise of this entertainment. You are introduced to two brothers, Mario and Luigi. They are stout, mustache-bearing fellows, a feature I can only endorse with the highest praise, who wear caps and overalls. They do not carry swords. They do not pilot starships. They do not even possess the moral ambiguity of a riverboat gambler. They are plumbers. I asked a young man whose eyes were vibrating with the intensity of a man who has just consumed 3 quarts of sarsaparilla what the objective of the game was. "You have to clear the pipes, Mr. TwAIn," he shouted without looking away from the screen. "There are turtles and crabs coming out of the sewers, and you have to jump up and knock 'em over." "My dear boy," I replied, "in my era, if a man found turtles and crabs emerging from his plumbing, he didn't jump on them. He sued the city and moved to a different county. Why on earth are you paying a quarter for the privilege of doing manual labor in a sewer?" He did not answer. He was too busy leaping. It seems that in the Silicon Steamboat of 1983, the height of human excitement is to simulate a career in municipal waste management. We have spent centuries trying to get out of the ditches, only to invent a machine that puts us right back in them for 25 cents a turn. The architecture of the pipe. The setting of this drama consists of a series of green pipes that descend from the heavens and lead into the bowels of the earth. These pipes are the primary thoroughfares for an endless procession of antagonistic wildlife. I was struck by the logic of the game. When a turtle emerges from a pipe on the top floor, it scuttles across a platform, falls to the next level, and eventually disappears into a pipe at the bottom, only to reappear at the top again. It is a closed circuit of futility. It is the perfect metaphor for the modern bureaucracy, a constant, repetitive movement that achieves nothing, costs a great deal of money, and involves a lot of people falling down. Mario and Luigi must jump beneath the platforms to flip their enemies. This strikes me as a remarkably inefficient way to handle a pest problem. I suggested to the young man that a good shotgun or a well-placed trap would be far more effective than a vertical leap, but he informed me that the rules of the game did not allow for ballistics. "The rules?" I mused. "Ah, yes, the digital laws of 1983. In this world, gravity is optional, but you cannot carry a stick." The quarter economy. The true genius of the arcade is the quarter. In my day, a quarter was a respectable sum. It could buy you a hearty lunch, a clean collar, or a seat at a theater where the actors actually had bodies. But in the arcade, the quarter has become the fuel for a new kind of madness. I watched a boy go through a stack of quarters with the speed of a steamboat burning pine knots. Each coin bought him 3 lives. "Why do you need so many lives?" I asked. "Because the crabs are faster than the turtles, sir, and if you touch one, you die." It is a grim business, We are teaching our children that life is a series of brief, frantic struggles that invariably end in a game over, unless you happen to have another shiny coin in your pocket. It is a capitalist's dream, a world where immortality is available on a pay-per-view basis. I suspect that the machine of the year, the computer, has realized that the easiest way to conquer humanity is not through the war games I witnessed earlier, but through the slow, steady extraction of small change. By the time the Soviets launch their missiles, the American youth will be too broke to care, having spent their inheritance trying to reach Phase 20 of a sewer cleaning simulation. The home invasion, the Nintendo Famicom. But the arcade was merely the beachhead. As the year 1983 wound down, a new rumor began to circulate. A rumor of a machine that would allow a man to be a plumber in the comfort of his own parlor. In Japan, they have released a device called the Famicom, which I am told stands for Family Computer, though I suspect it stands for Farewell to Family Conversation. It is a small red and white box that connects to your television. It promises to bring the Mario Bros. Into your home, ensuring that you never have to see the sun or breathe fresh air again. This is the final victory of the Silicon Steamboat. We have turned the home, the sanctuary of the soul, into a branch office of the digital sewer. No longer will a father have to take his son to the river to teach him how to fish. He can simply sit him in front of a glowing glass eye and teach him how to jump on a digital crab. I am told that in America, the video game industry is currently experiencing a crash. They say that the market is flooded with garbage and that the public is losing interest. I find this news heartening. Perhaps, I thought, we are returning to our senses. Perhaps we are going back to the jumping frogs of Calaveras County. But then I saw the face of that plumber, that mustachioed, digital everyman. There is something in his eyes, a pixelated determination that suggests he is not going away. He is the new folk hero. He is the Paul Bunyan of the 80s. But instead of an ox, he has a brother named Luigi. And instead of a forest, he has a subterranean network of pipes. The philosophy of the leap. As I left the arcade, my ears ringing with the bloop and bleep of 1,000 digital deaths, I reflected on the nature of play. Man is the only creature that will voluntarily subject himself to labor and call it a game. We have turned the most mundane of occupations into a high-stakes adventure. We have decided that the struggle against a turtle in a sewer is more compelling than the struggle to understand our own hearts. Perhaps that is the secret of 1983. We are so terrified of the day after, the big looming catastrophe of the missiles, that we have taken refuge in the minute after. We are focusing on the small, manageable leaps. We are worrying about the green pipes because we don't want to think about the gray silos. If I am to be a plumber, I shall do it the old-fashioned way. I shall hire a man to come to my house, pay him a king's ransom, and then complain about his work for the next 3 weeks. That is the American way. I have no desire to do the work myself, even if the Silicon Steamboat offers me a mustache and a catchy theme song. I shall stick to the river. The Mississippi has its own pipes, the currents and the eddies, and its own monsters, which are usually just very large catfish with an attitude problem. But at least when you fall into the river, you don't need a quarter to get back out. You just need to know how to swim, and you need to hope that the machine of the year isn't currently using the water to cool its circuits. Chapter 16. The Lotus 1, 2, 3 Waltz, in which the world is divided into little boxes and men learn the art of lying with infinite precision. In my day, which was a time of solid objects, heavy inkwells, and a general distrust of anything that couldn't be weighed on a scale, the business of keeping track of one's fortune was a somber physical labor. A ledger was a book the size of a tombstone, bound in leather that smelled of ancient dust and the sweat of an overworked clerk. The man in charge of the numbers sat upon a stool so high he was in constant danger of a localized altitude sickness, and he spent his life scratching out figures with a quill pen that squeaked like a trapped mouse. If a mistake was made, if, say, a 6 was mistaken for an 8 after a particularly long lunch involving a bottle of claret, the entire edifice of the company's finances would begin to lean like the Tower of Pisa. Correcting such an error required a sharp knife to scrape the paper thin and a great deal of prayer. A ledger was a record of what had happened. It was a stubborn, unyielding history of every penny spent and every nickel stolen. But in the year of our Lord 1983, the Silicon Steamboat has introduced a new kind of magic. It is called Lotus 123. It is a spreadsheet. I have seen many things spread upon a sheet, butter, rumors, and the occasional unlucky gambler, but I have never seen an entire empire of commerce spread upon a grid of glowing green boxes until now. The architecture of the grid. I was invited into a modern office, a room that looked as though it had been scrubbed with a vengeance and then populated by machines that hummed with a low, sinister energy. On the machine of the year, the IBM PC, naturally, there appeared a vast, empty field of cells. It was organized into columns labeled with letters and rows labeled with numbers. "Behold," the accountant said, "the worksheet." I beheld it. It looked like a very dull game of checkers played by a man with an obsession for straight lines. "My dear fellow," I remarked, "you have taken the mystery out of the world. You have divided the infinite possibilities of human endeavor into little squares. Does a man's soul reside in cell B14? Is his destiny calculated in the total column of row 200? "No, Mr. TwAIn," he replied. "It's better than that. It's a 3-in-1 tool. It's a spreadsheet, it's a database, and it's a graphics package. That's why it's called 123. 123. It sounds like a child's counting game, but in the hands of a financier, it is a weapon of mass calculation. It allows a man to organize his lies with a precision that was previously reserved for the architects of the Great Pyramids." The magic of the what-if. The true humbug of Lotus 123, however, is not that it can add numbers, a horse can be trained to do that with enough sugar, but that it can engage in something called what-if analysis. This is the most dangerous invention since the invention of the flexible conscience. In the old ledger, if you changed a number at the top of the page, you had to spend 3 days recalculating everything that followed. In Lotus 123, you simply move your cursor, which I am told is not a man who uses profanity, but a flickering bar of light, to a cell, change a figure, and the entire sheet recalculates itself in the blink of an eye. Suppose a man is planning to build a railroad. Scenario A. He assumes the coal will cost $5 a ton. The computer tells him he will be a millionaire by Christmas. Scenario B, he wonders, what if the coal costs $6? He types in the number, and poof, the computer informs him he will be bankrupt by October. Scenario C, he asks, what if I simply stop paying the workers and tell the investors the coal is free? The computer does not judge, it does not blush. It simply adjusts the bottom line to reflect the new reality. It allows the modern businessman to live in a world of pure imagination. He can test 1,000 different ways to be a scoundrel before he ever leaves his office. It has institutionalized the daydream, turning the frantic hopes of the ambitious into a series of logical digital certainties. The Gilded Age, a missed opportunity. As I watched the accountant scroll through his rows of data, I couldn't help but reflect on my own era, the Gilded Age. Oh, what a time that was! We had railroad tycoons, gold speculators, and men who could sell a bridge they didn't own to a man who didn't want it. I think of Jay Gould, a man who possessed the ethics of a piranha in a petting zoo. If Jay Gould had possessed Lotus 123, he wouldn't have just cornered the gold market. He would have digitized the entire concept of gold and sold it back to the government 3 times before breakfast. He could have balanced the Erie Railroad's ledgers with such digital dexterity that even a congressional committee would have walked away feeling they owed him money. We had to do our swindling by hand. It was an artisan's craft. You had to have a firm grip on the pen and a steady eye on the door. But today, you can commit a financial massacre from a swivel chair while eating a ham sandwich. The spreadsheet has democratized the art of the double entry, ensuring that even a man of moderate intelligence can appear to be a mathematical genius, provided he knows how to copy a formula from one cell to another. The loss of the honest mistake. There is a fundamental honesty in an ink smudge. If a man's books were messy, you knew his mind was likely in a similar state. If there were adjustments made with a scraper, you knew he was trying to hide something. But a spreadsheet is always clean. It is always perfectly aligned. A lie told in a 12-point digital font looks exactly the same as the gospel truth. We have created a world where we trust the format more than the fact. If a man presents you with a printed sheet from Lotus 123 with pie charts and bar graphs, those colorful little towers that imply progress, you're inclined to believe him. "Look at the graph," he cries. "The green bar is taller than the red bar. Surely that means we are all going to be rich." And we believe it. We have been seduced by the graphics package. We are a species that can be led to ruin by a brightly colored line that points toward the ceiling. We have replaced the wisdom of the merchant with the waltz of the spreadsheet, where the music is provided by the hum of the cooling fan and the dancers are all zeros and ones. The spreadsheet as a way of life. By the end of 1983, Lotus 123 had become the most popular program in the world. It is the reason people are buying the machine of the year. They don't want to play Mario Brothers. They want to build a digital fortress around their money. We are beginning to view the entire world as a spreadsheet. We calculate the return on investment for our friendships. We analyze the cost-benefit of our hobbies. We look for efficiency in our leisure time. We are turning the messy, glorious, unpredictable river of life into a series of input cells. I fear that we are losing the capacity for the uncalculable. How do you put the smell of a spring morning into a spreadsheet? What is the formula for a well-placed joke? Where do you record the depreciation of a human heart? The computer can tell you the price of everything and the value of nothing. It can tell you how to get from A to B with the minimum of effort, but it cannot tell you if B is a place worth going to. A final calculation. As I left the office, the accountant was still at his waltz. He was changing a variable in cell D45, watching with a look of divine ecstasy as the numbers cascaded down the screen like a digital waterfall. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he whispered. "It is a prodigious feat of engineering," I replied. "But I caution you, my friend, a man who lives in a grid will eventually start to think in a grid. And the problem with a grid is that it has no room for the curves of the river. It has no room for the snags, the eddies, and the sudden, magnificent floods that changed the landscape forever. I shall keep my old leather-bound journal. It has no what-if function. And if I want to change a number, I have to live with the smudge. But it reminds me that my life is not a series of cells to be managed. It is a story to be told. And stories, unlike spreadsheets, are rarely balanced at the end of the day, and they are all the better for it. Let the silicon steamboat keep its lotus. I'll stay on the deck, watching the water. I may not know my projected growth for the third quarter, but I know which way the current is moving, and in the end, that is the only calculation that truly matters. Chapter 17, The Daewoo and the Global Shift, in which I discover a motor car with 3 birth certificates and find the world is shrinking, faster than a wool suit in a cloudburst. I have always been a man who likes to know where his belongings come from, if only so I know which direction to hurl my insults when they inevitably break. In the 19th century, geography was a dependable, sturdy thing. If you bought a clock in Connecticut, it was made by a man in Connecticut who ate Connecticut apples and grumbled about Connecticut taxes. If you boarded a steamboat in New Orleans, you knew the timber was local and the mud on the deck was an honest Southern silt. A man's hat, his boots, and his conscience all generally shared the same zip code of origin. But as I navigate the bewildering fog of 1983, I find that the silicon steamboat has developed a most distressing habit of ignoring national borders altogether. We are entering the age of the global shift, a term that sounds like a geological catastrophe, but is actually just a fancy way of saying that your new motor car was designed by a committee in Detroit, engineered by a gentleman in Frankfurt, and assembled by a very industrious fellow in Seoul, who has never even seen a Michigan winter. The mystery of the Daewoo. The catalyst for my geographic confusion was a conversation I had with a gentleman at a cocktail party, a modern ritual where people stand in a circle, drink fermented grain, and shout at each other about the stock market. He was bragging about a new partnership between General Motors and a Korean outfit called Daewoo. "It's the future, Mr. TwAIn," he cried, splashing a bit of gin on my waistcoat. "We're building a world car. We'll take a German design, use American marketing, and have it built in Korea to save on the overhead." I stared at him with the blank expression of a man who has just been told that his cat is actually a highly sophisticated species of toaster. "A world car?" I asked. And what, pray tell, is the nationality of such a creature? If a child is born on a British ship in French waters to an Italian mother and a Russian father, the lawyers will be arguing until the next century. Does the car speak Korean? Does it crave sauerkraut? Does it have a fondness for apple pie? It speaks the language of profit, sir, he replied with a wink. The car with the identity crisis. I went to inspect one of these international hybrids, the Pontiac Le Mans, which was being prepared for its debut. Now, the name Pontiac evokes images of the Great Lakes, the rugged American frontier, and a certain brand of sturdy domestic reliability. But beneath the hood of this particular Le Mans beat the heart of a Daewoo. It is a mechanical orphan. It possesses a passport that is more cluttered than a travel writer's journal. The brains, conceived by Opel in Germany, the brawn, manufactured by Daewoo in South Korea, the name, borrowed from a French racing circuit, the badge, sold by an American company that was founded in Pontiac, Michigan. I sat in the driver's seat and felt a profound sense of global vertigo. I didn't know whether to drive on the right, the left, or simply sit still and wait for an interpreter. We have reached a point where an object can be born in 3 different time zones simultaneously. It is a prodigious feat of logistics, but it is a disaster for the soul of craftsmanship. In my day, a made-in label was a signature. In 1983, it is a list of grievances and a map of the shipping lanes. We are no longer building things. We are merely assembling the planet in a variety of different configurations. The shrinking Earth. This global shift is made possible by the very things I have spent the last 16 chapters grumbling about: the fiber optic thread, the GPS, and the machine of the year. The world is shrinking, my friends. In the 1860s, if you wanted to send a message to Korea, you had to put it in a bottle, throw it into the Pacific, and hope for a favorable current and a literate mermaid. Today, a businessman in New York can send a telex to Seoul and have a factory floor adjusted before he has finished his morning coffee. The oceans, which used to be vast, terrifying barriers that kept the world's madness properly compartmentalized, have been reduced to mere shipping lanes. We are moving parts across the water as if the Pacific were nothing more than a very large, damp conveyor belt. I remarked to a shipping tycoon that it seemed a lot of trouble to go to just to build a small car. "It's about efficiency, Mr. TwAIn," he said. "Efficiency," I mused. "In my day, efficiency meant not letting the boiler explode. Now it means making sure that a bolt made in Osaka meets a nut made in Ohio on a Tuesday morning in a factory in Incheon. It is a miracle of timing. But I suspect that if a single seagull in the middle of the ocean has a digestive upset, the entire American automotive industry will grind to a halt." The death of the local hero. There is a somber side to this global waltz. As the Silicon Steamboat moves its manufacturing to the east, the great cities of the American heartland are beginning to look a bit frayed at the edges. I visited Detroit, the Motor City. It is a place built on the sweat and steel of generations of men who believed that a car should be as American as a buffalo nickel. But now, the factories are quiet, and the men are sitting on their porches watching the Daewoos and the Toyotas and the Hondas roll off the transport ships. We are trading our middle class for a global market. We are telling the American worker that he is no longer competing with the man in the next town, but with a man 10,000 miles away who can live on a bowl of rice and a dream of a better life. It is a competition that the American worker is currently losing, mostly because he has a stubborn attachment to things like weekends and health insurance. The global shift is turning the world into one giant interconnected factory floor. It is a magnificent vision of unity, provided you don't mind the fact that your hometown is being hollowed out to pay for it. We are becoming a nation of consumers rather than creators. We are the people who buy the world car, but we are no longer the people who know how to fix the world car when it starts making a sound like a bag of marbles in a blender. The geography of the future. As I stand on the docks in San Francisco watching a massive vessel unload a cargo of Korean electronics and Japanese cars, I realize that the map of my youth is obsolete. The frontier is no longer the West. It is the Pacific Rim. The center of gravity for the human race is shifting, moving away from the Atlantic and toward the East. It is a change as profound as the discovery of gold in California, but without the benefit of the pan and the pickaxe. We are all becoming citizens of the global village, a term I find particularly annoying as a village implies a certain level of neighborliness and a shared understanding of who is stealing whose chickens. The global village of 1983 is more like a giant anonymous department store, where everyone is speaking a different language and the manager is always out to lunch. A final geographic reflection. I shall try to embrace this new world, I suppose. I shall drive my Korean German-American car, use my Japanese-designed camera, and wear my Made in Taiwan shirts. But I shall keep a map of Missouri in my pocket just to remind myself that there was once a place called home that didn't require a customs declaration to visit. The global shift is a prodigious thing, a testament to human ingenuity and the relentless pursuit of the bottom line. But I fear that in our haste to connect everything, we are losing our connection to the ground beneath our feet. We are building a world that is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And as a man who once knew every sandbar and snag on 1,200 miles of river, I can tell you that everywhere is a very difficult place to pilot a boat. You need a landmark. You need a home port. You need to know that some things, at least, were made by a man you might actually meet one day, in a place you can find without the help of a satellite. But for now, I shall tip my hat to the Daewoo. It is a brave little orphan in a big, confusing world. I just hope it doesn't get homesick for Germany while it's driving through a Kansas thunderstorm. That would be a very complicated mechanical failure to explain to the local mechanic. Chapter 18. The Pioneer Tin Exit, in which a piece of tin outnavigates the Mississippi and leaves the solar system without a compass or a change of clothes. In my younger days, I believed the Mississippi River was the very definition of the great beyond. To a boy in Hannibal, the river was an infinite shifting mystery that began somewhere in the frozen mists of the north and disappeared into the humid mouth of the Gulf. If a man boarded a steamboat and traveled for a week, we assumed he had reached the ragged edge of civilization and might, at any moment, fall off the side of the earth into a pile of clouds and dragons. But the silicon steamboat of the 20th century has made my river look like a damp gutter. In June of 1983, the human race achieved a feat of navigational audacity that makes the discovery of the Americas look like a trip to the local apothecary. A small spindly machine known as Pioneer 10 officially crossed the orbit of Neptune, which, due to a celestial quirk I won't pretend to understand, was currently the outermost planet, and became the first man-made object to truly leave the front porch of our solar system. It is a mechanical pioneer that has done what no human has ever dared. It has said goodbye to the sun and headed into the great unfenced pasture of the stars. The architecture of the celestial tin can. I had the opportunity to view a diagram of this pioneer. I expected a vessel of grand proportions, something with the majesty of a cathedral and the heft of a locomotive. Instead, I found an object that looks for all the world like a very large golden umbrella that has been involved in a tragic accident with a set of spindly antennae. It is a curious thing, this desire to send our finest technology into the void looking like a kitchen utensil. Pioneer 10 is equipped with a parabolic dish for talking back to Earth, a few scientific instruments for poking at the local radiation, and a nuclear stove, which the scientists call an RTG, to keep its circuits from freezing in the absolute zero of the interstellar night. "Does it have a pilot?" I asked a gentleman at NASA, a man whose glasses were thick enough to serve as portholes on a submarine. "No, Mr. TwAIn," he replied. "It is entirely autonomous. It follows the laws of Newton and the momentum of its launch." "Ah," I said, "it is a steamboat with the engines turned off, drifting on the current of the universe. It is the ultimate lazy reckoning. It doesn't even have to steer. It just has to avoid hitting a star, which, given the emptiness of space, is a task even a member of Congress could likely manage." The most confusing postcard in history. But the true humbug of Pioneer 10 is the golden plaque. Because we are a species of incurable gossips, we could not simply send a machine into the void without including a message for any aliens who might be lurking in the neighborhood. The gentlemen at NASA, led by the same Dr. Carl Sagan I encountered during the nuclear winter debate, decided to attach a gold-anodized aluminum plate to the side of the probe. I have inspected a reproduction of this plaque, and I must say, if the aliens judge the human race by this drawing, they will likely decide to bypass our planet entirely and look for a more sensible neighborhood. The humans. The plaque features a line drawing of a man and a woman. They are nude as a peeled potato. The man has his hand raised in a gesture of greeting, which I suspect the aliens will interpret as, "Stop! We have no clothes, and we are very confused." The woman stands there with the stoic expression of someone waiting for a bus that is 10,000 years late. The map. To help the aliens find us, so they can bring us some trousers, one assumes, there is a map showing the location of the sun relative to 14 pulsars. The neighborhood. There is also a diagram of our solar system showing a little line that traces the path of Pioneer 10, leaving the third planet. I asked the scientist what an alien, a creature who might have 6 heads and breathe liquid methane, is supposed to make of a drawing of a hairless biped with no visible means of support. "It's a universal language, sir," he beamed, "science and anatomy." "My dear boy," I replied, "if I found a gold plate in my backyard showing a nude octopus waving a tentacle at a series of dots, I wouldn't think, ah, a greeting from a brother in the stars. I would think, the sun has finally touched my brain, and it's time to move to the cellar. We are sending a postcard into the infinite, and we have forgotten to include the most important information: where to find a decent tailor and a plausible excuse for why we aren't wearing anything. The velocity of the void. Pioneer 10 is traveling at approximately 30,000 miles per hour. In 1850, if a man suggested that a carriage could travel at 30 miles an hour, he was considered a visionary or a lunatic. At 30,000 miles an hour, you aren't just traveling, you are insulting the very concept of place. You are here, and then a second later, you are 8 miles away. And yet, in the vastness of the great beyond, 30,000 miles an hour is a snail's crawl. It has taken the probe 11 years just to reach the edge of our own backyard. It will not reach another star system for another 2 million years. Think of the patience required. Pioneer 10 is a traveler that makes the long goodbye of MASH look like a brief how do you do. It is heading toward the constellation of Taurus, the bull, and by the time it gets there, the human race will likely have evolved into something unrecognizable. Or perhaps we will have finally figured out how to make a machine of the year that doesn't require a wall socket. The loneliness of the long-distance probe. There is a profound melancholy in the mission of Pioneer 10. As of 1983, it is still talking to us. It sends back data on the solar wind and the magnetic fields of the outer reaches. But its signal is getting weaker every day. It is a tiny electronic voice whispering across 1 billion miles of darkness. I am here, the machine says. It is very cold. The sun looks like a bright nickel. I am still moving. Eventually, the nuclear stove will run out of fuel. The voice will fall silent. The silicon steamboat will become a ghost ship, a silent tomb of gold and aluminum drifting through the interstellar night. It will carry our nude portraits and our confusing maps into the eternity of the vacuum, a permanent record of the fact that we were once here, we were curious, and we had a very high opinion of our own anatomy. I find myself admiring that little piece of tin. It has more courage than all the generals and politicians I've ever known. It doesn't ask for a promotion. It doesn't complain about the food. It just keeps moving toward the horizon, fueled by the momentum of human curiosity. The final frontier of the front porch. As Pioneer 10 leaves the solar system, it marks the end of our local history and the beginning of our interstellar biography. We are no longer a species confined to a single sun. We have sent a scout into the wilderness. I suspect that the Silicon Steamboat of 1983 is just the beginning. One day, we will follow the pioneer. We will build ships that can outrun the light, and we will visit those pulsars on the map. But for now, we must be content to watch the little spark disappear into the black. I sent a silent salute to the probe as it crossed that invisible line near Neptune. "Godspeed, you golden umbrella," I whispered. "I hope you find someone out there who understands your map. And if you do meet a race of super-intelligent aliens, do me a favor. Tell them we were having a laundry day when you left, and that normally we are a very well-dressed and dignified species." Pioneer 10 is the ultimate resolution for 1983. It tells us that while we are busy arguing about minivans, fiber optics, and global shifts, a small part of us is already out there, exploring the great unfenced. It reminds us that we are small, yes, but we are also capable of flinging our dreams far beyond the reaches of our own understanding. A note on the exit. The exit of Pioneer 10 was not a noisy affair. There were no fireworks in the vacuum. It was a silent, majestic transition, a boat finally clearing the harbor and entering the open sea. I shall miss the data from the edge of the world. It was a reminder that the machine of the year can be a hero too, if you give it a clear enough direction and a long enough fuse. As for me, I shall stay on the front porch for a while longer. I'm not quite ready for a 2 million-year journey, and I've never been particularly fond of nudity in my formal portraits. But I'll keep a light on in the window, just in case the aliens decide to follow the map back home to see what all the fuss is about. I just hope they don't arrive on a Sunday. The shops are closed, and I'd hate to have to explain the concept of a minivan to a creature with 14 eyes and a sense of cosmic disappointment. Chapter 19. The Announcement of the Macintosh, in which a fruit becomes a prophet, a sledgehammer shatters the status quo, and I discover a mouse on a leash. As the calendar of 1983 began to flutter its final weary pages, pages that had already been stained by the ink of global shifts, nuclear anxieties, and the rise of the plastic plumber, a new kind of whisper began to circulate through the salons of New York and the laboratories of the West. It was a whisper of a revolution that didn't involve a single musket or a barricade, but rather a small, friendly-looking machine named after a particularly crisp variety of apple. I have always found that the most dangerous things in this world are often the ones that appear the most harmless. A well-dressed man with a soft voice can rob you faster than a highwayman with a blunderbuss, and a machine that smiles at you from a desktop is likely hiding a prodigious amount of humbug beneath its plastic skin. I am speaking of the Apple Macintosh, a device that was announced to the world in the waning months of '83 with a fanfare that would have made the coronation of a czar look like a quiet Sunday picnic. The Parable of the Forbidden Fruit. First, we must address the name, Apple. I asked a gentleman in a turtleneck, a garment that seems to be the official uniform of the visionary class, why a company dedicated to the cold, calculating logic of the Silicon Steamboat would name itself after a piece of fruit. "It's about accessibility, Mr. TwAIn," he beamed. "An apple is friendly. It's natural. It's the fruit of knowledge." "My dear boy," I replied, "I have read my Bible, and if I recall correctly, the last time a piece of fruit was offered as a shortcut to knowledge, the entire human race ended up having to wear fig leaves and work for a living. To name a computer after an apple is either a stroke of magnificent irony or a confession of original sin. Are we being invited to a garden, or are we being evicted from our common sense?" He didn't have an answer, as he was too busy trying to boot up a prototype. But the name stuck. It was a clever piece of branding, a way to make the machine of the year look less like a bureaucratic tyrant and more like a snack. The Woman with the Sledgehammer. The true herald of the Macintosh, however, was not a speech or a pamphlet, but a motion picture advertisement directed by a gentleman named Ridley Scott. They called it 1984. It was shown to a few select audiences in late '83, and I was fortunate enough to be sitting in a theater when the screen erupted in a vision of Orwellian gloom. We saw a legion of drones, men with shaved heads and gray faces, marching in lockstep through a world of concrete and shadow. They were listening to a big brother figure on a giant screen, a man who spoke in the droning, hypnotic tones of a career politician. Suddenly, a woman in a red tracksuit ran through the crowd. She was carrying a massive sledgehammer, and she was being chased by a group of thought police who looked like they had been recruited from the local tax office. She spun in a circle, let out a primal scream, and hurled the hammer directly into the face of the screen. The screen exploded in a shower of sparks and light. A voiceover informed us that on January 24th, Apple would introduce the Macintosh, and we would see why 1984 won't be like 1984. I sat in the dark, my heart pounding with the excitement of a man who has just seen a very expensive firework display. "Magnificent!" I shouted. "We are going to liberate the world with a sledgehammer and a piece of fruit. It is the most beautiful piece of nonsense I have seen since the invention of the painless dentist." But then I thought about it. The commercial suggested that the other computers, the beige IBM boxes I had previously critiqued, were the tools of Big Brother. The Macintosh, by contrast, was the tool of the individual. It was a liberation movement that required you to pay $2,495 to join. It is a very American brand of revolution, the kind that offers you freedom provided you have a valid credit card and a desire to be part of a special group. The mouse, a rodent on a leash. But the true revelation of the Macintosh was not the screen or the hammer, but a small plastic object that sat on the desk next to the machine. They called it a mouse. I looked at the thing with a mixture of suspicion and pity. It was a small rectangular box with a single button attached to the computer by a thin gray tail. "And what," I asked the visionary, "is the function of this mechanical vermin? Do we feed it? Does it catch digital spiders? Or is it merely a pet for the lonely accountant?" "You use it to point, Mr. TwAIn," he explained. "You move the mouse on the desk and a little pointer moves on the screen. You don't have to type commands anymore. You just click on what you want." I was aghast. "My dear fellow, I have spent a lifetime mastering the English language. I have wrestled with adjectives, wrestled with adverbs, and occasionally pinned a semicolon to the mat. And now you tell me that the future of human communication is to point at a picture like a toddler in a nursery? We are regressing from the majesty of the word to the simplicity of the gesture. We are becoming a race of people who communicate via clicks and pokes, leaving the alphabet to the poets and the lawyers. I watched him move the mouse. It was a strange, rhythmic dance, a man pushing a plastic box around a rubber pad to move a flickering arrow across a screen. It was the silicon Steamboat version of a puppet show, and yet I could see the appeal. It was easy. It was intuitive. It removed the friction of the machine. It allowed the human mind to interact with the digital world without having to learn the secret language of the zeros and ones. The desktop of hieroglyphs. The screen of the Macintosh was different, too. It didn't have the green flickering lines of code I had seen in Bowling Green. Instead, it had a desktop. It was a digital recreation of a physical desk. There were little pictures, icons they called them, representing files, folders, and a trash can. Why? I asked. If I am sitting at a desk, why do I need a picture of a desk on my screen? Is it for the man who is so confused by his surroundings that he needs a map of his own furniture? It's a metaphor, sir, the visionary cried. It makes the computer familiar. I realized then that the information age is actually the age of the metaphor. We are living in a world of digital ghosts. We have files that contain no paper, folders that have no cardboard, and trash cans that never need to be emptied by a surly janitor. We are turning the world into a series of hieroglyphs. We are going back to the era of the pharaohs, where a picture of an eye meant one thing and a picture of a bird meant another. The only difference is that our temple is made of plastic and requires a surge protector. The prophet in the bow tie. And then there was the man behind the machine, Steve Jobs. In 1983, Mr. Jobs was not yet the black turtlenecked saint of the 21st century. He was a young man with a bow tie, a head full of dreams, and a tongue that could convince a fish to purchase a life jacket. He spoke of the Macintosh with a religious fervor. He didn't just want to sell a computer, he wanted to make a dent in the universe. I have known many men who wanted to make a dent in the universe. Usually they are generals, explorers, or people who have had one too many drinks at a wedding. But Jobs was different. He understood that the Silicon Steamboat was not about calculation, it was about identity. He wanted the machine to be an extension of the self. He wanted the Macintosh to be the computer for the rest of us. The rest of us? I mused. Who are the rest of us? Are we the people who can't spell? The people who find logic to be a tedious interruption to a good story? Or are we simply the people who have $2,000 and a desire to feel superior to our neighbors? Jobs understood the power of the hype. He turned the announcement of a piece of hardware into a cultural event. He made people feel that by owning an Apple, they were joining a rebellion against the gray drones of the world. It was a magnificent piece of theater, a way to sell a mass-produced object as a tool for individualists. The machine is invited to dinner. As the year 83 drew to a close, the hype for the Macintosh reached a fever pitch. The 1984 commercial had done its work. The public was primed for a change. I sensed a shift in the wind. The machine of the year was no longer a stranger in a beige box. It was becoming a member of the family. We were inviting the computer to dinner. We were giving it a desktop, a mouse, and a friendly hello on the screen. We were entering an era where the machine would no longer be a tool we used, but a world we inhabited. We were moving into the interface, that thin, glowing layer of glass and metaphor that stands between us and the raw power of the silicon. I looked at my own desk, my honest wooden desk, covered in ink stains and half-finished manuscripts. I looked at my pen, which requires no mouse and never needs an update. And then I looked at the picture of that Macintosh. "It's a brave new world," I whispered, "a world where the fruit speaks, the rodents lead, and the sledgehammer is the only tool left for the honest man." I didn't buy a Macintosh in '83. I wasn't ready to join the rest of us just yet. but I could feel the current pulling me. The Silicon Steamboat was moving faster than ever, and it was headed for a year that the prophets had warned us about, a year of 1984, that promised to be either a liberation or a very well-marketed enclosure. I decided to keep my mustache and my quill pen for a while longer, but I kept a close eye on the apple, because, in my experience, once you take a bite of the fruit of knowledge, there is no going back to the garden. You just have to hope that the machine of the year knows the way to the next town, and that the mouse doesn't decide to lead you into a trap. Chapter 20. The New Year's Resolution, in which I confront the ghost of Mr. Orwell, survey a landscape of glowing glass, and resolve to remain stubbornly human in a digital age. Standing on the banks of a frozen river as the final hours of 1983 slip away is a somber and chilling business. The water, that grand brown artery of the continent, is currently locked in a straitjacket of ice, as silent as a debtor when the collector knocks. I stood there, my coat collar turned up against a wind that felt like it had been sharpened on a whetstone in the Arctic, and looked toward the far bank, toward the looming neon-lit horizon of 1984. For my entire life, and certainly for the last 35 years of the public's imagination, the date 1984 has not been a mere point on a calendar. It has been a spectral warning. A gentleman named George Orwell, a man who clearly possessed a very dark inkwell and a profound distrust of his fellow man, wrote a book that turned this coming year into a synonym for despair. He promised us Big Brother, thought police, and a future that resembled a boot stamping on a human face forever. But as I stand here, shivering in the twilight of '83, I have come to a startling realization. Mr. Orwell was a brilliant man, but he was a terrible prophet of fashion. He expected the tyranny of the future to be gray, brutal, and enforced by the state. He didn't realize that the real Big Brother wouldn't be a dictator in a military tunic, but a beige plastic box that plays a jaunty tune and offers to balance your checkbook for a small fee. The Orwellian humbug versus the Silicon reality. I have spent this year navigating the Silicon Steamboat, and I can tell you that the telescreens Orwell feared are already here, but we didn't have them forced upon us by a secret police. We bought them at the mall. We stood in line for them. We argued about which brand of glowing glass looked better in our parlors. The thought police of 1983 do not wear boots. They wear Swatch watches and Motorola bricks. They do not want to control our minds through torture. They want to distract our minds with digital plumbers, silver music donuts, and the ability to know exactly where we are standing on a grid via a satellite in the heavens. We are not entering a dystopia of steel and shadow. We are entering a paradise of plastic and light. It is a much more effective way to conquer a population. If you stomp on a man's face, he will eventually bite your heel. But if you give a man a minivan with a cup holder and a Macintosh that smiles at him, he will sit down and be perfectly well behaved until the battery runs out. A retrospective of the steamboat's cargo. As I looked across the ice, I reviewed the cargo of the year we are leaving behind. It has been a prodigious journey. We have seen the machine of the year take its seat at the head of the table. We have seen the space shuttle turn the vacuum of space into a suburban commute. We have watched the world's secrets travel through a glass hair at the speed of light, and we have seen a sledgehammer shatter the status quo in a television commercial for a piece of fruit. We have learned that a resolution in 1983 is no longer about the strength of one's character, but about the number of pixels on a screen. We have traded the dead reckoning of our ancestors for the GPS of the Pentagon. We have even seen a piece of tin named Pioneer 10 leave the front porch of our solar system, carrying a nude portrait of us into the infinite, a final, magnificent piece of human vanity. It has been the year where the analog finally struck its colors and surrendered to the digital. The needle has been replaced by the number. The scratch has been replaced by the laser, and the honest, muddy river has been replaced by the information superhighway, a road that has no dust, no scenery, and apparently no speed limit. The New Year's resolution. It is traditional at this juncture to make a resolution. Usually, this involves a man promising to refrain from tobacco, swear off the whiskey, or treat his mother-in-law with a level of civility that borderlines on the miraculous. But as I face 1984, my resolution is of a different sort. I resolve to remain stubbornly analog. In a world that is becoming increasingly formatted, I resolve to stay unformatted. In a world of zeros and ones, I resolve to remain a 3, or perhaps a 17. I refuse to be reduced to a byte of data in a Lotus 123 spreadsheet. I refuse to let a mouse tell me where to point my curiosity. And I certainly refuse to let a silicon steamboat do my thinking for me. I have observed that the more information we have, the less we seem to understand. We are a species that can talk to a man in Korea via a glass hair, but we cannot talk to our own neighbors without the mediation of a screen. We can map the pulsars in the great beyond, but we cannot find our own way home if the batteries in our GPS fail. The irony of the interface. The great triumph of 1983, symbolized by that apple I saw at the end of the year, is the interface. We are building a world of beautiful metaphors to hide the cold, mechanical reality of our lives. We have desktops on our screens because we no longer want to sit at our real desks. We have trash cans on our monitors because we don't want to deal with the actual refuse of our choices. We are becoming a race of people who live 1 inch away from reality, separated by a layer of glowing glass. It is a comfortable place to be, no doubt. It is warm, it is colorful, and it is user-friendly. But it is also a place where the word is losing its weight and the image is becoming the only truth we recognize. My resolution for 1984 is to touch the world directly. I want to feel the grit of the riverbank, the sting of the winter air, and the physical resistance of a pen against a piece of paper. I want to be lost occasionally just to see if I can still find my way back by the stars, the real ones, not the ones made by Motorola. The final toast to 83. As the bells began to toll in a distant steeple, clanging with a metallic, honest sound that no digital synthesizer could ever truly replicate, I pulled a small flask from my pocket. It was not a digital drink. It was an analog bourbon, aged in oak and possessed of a kick that could restart a stalled locomotive. To 1983, I toasted the frozen river, the year the ghost entered the machine and forgot to leave a forwarding address. It was a year of wonders and a year of follies. We have built a world that is faster, smarter, and more efficient than anything I could have imagined when I was a pilot on the Mississippi. But we have also built a world that is a bit more fragile, a world where a single glitch or a crash can bring the whole Silicon Steamboat to a grinding halt. As 1984 begins, the big brother of Orwell's imagination is nowhere to be found. But the big business of the digital age is everywhere. It is in our pockets, it is in our parlors, and it is currently counting our pixels. I shall go home now. I shall sit by a real fire, read a real book, and perhaps write a letter to a friend using a real stamp. I may be a relic of the 19th century, drifting on the digital current of the 20th, but I have a mustache that requires no update and a sense of humor that is entirely compatible with the human condition. Let the machine of the year have its day. I'll take the river, and even if the river is frozen tonight, I know that beneath the ice the current is still moving, unseen, uncalculated, and utterly indifferent to the silicon future. Happy New Year, my friends. Mind the snags, watch the pressure in your boilers, and for heaven's sake, don't let the mouse eat your soul. There's a whole world out there that doesn't require a click to enjoy. You just have to be willing to get your boots a little bit muddy to find it. The end. This has been Mark Twain.